A gunshot echoed across the desert, and Eleanor Whitaker's solitary life ended forever. The blood-soaked stranger collapsed at her doorstep wasn't just another drifter. He was danger incarnate, mystery wrapped in leather and dust, carrying secrets that could destroy everything she'd built in her years of brutal survival. One decision, one night, one choice that would either save her or bury her beneath the unforgiving Arizona sand. Welcome to a story of courage, betrayal, and impossible second chances under the merciless frontier sky. If you're watching from Dallas, Sao Paulo, Manila, or anywhere across this vast world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this tale of the American West can travel. And if this story grabs hold of your heart the way that stranger grabbed hold of Eleanor's fate, smash that like button and settle in. Because what happens next will change everything you thought you knew about love, survival, and starting over when the world says you're too old, too broken, too late. This is their story, and it begins with blood on the threshold. The desert didn't forgive mistakes. Eleanor Whitaker had learned that lesson 23 years ago when she'd first arrived in the Arizona Territory with her husband Thomas, both of them burning with dreams of ranching success and wide-open futures. The land had other ideas. It took Thomas 12 years later, a riding accident in a flash flood that shouldn't have happened, couldn't have been predicted, and left Eleanor with nothing but debts, silence, and a sprawling property she could barely manage alone. Now, at 57, she'd made peace with loneliness. Or so she told herself every morning when she rose before dawn to feed the horses, mend the fences Thomas had built, and watch the sun bleed across mesas that stretched endlessly toward Mexico. The ranch sat isolated, nestled in a valley 20 miles from the nearest town of Copper Ridge, a deliberate distance Thomas had chosen for privacy and independence. In the years since his death, that distance had become Eleanor's fortress and her prison. November 1887 brought cold nights and colder memories. Eleanor sat on her porch that evening, a rifle across her lap, not because she expected trouble, but because the desert was unpredictable and she'd stopped being careless years ago. The sky had turned that peculiar shade of purple-black that preceded true darkness, stars beginning to pierce through like scattered diamonds. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out, its howl lonely and defiant. Then she heard the hoofbeats. Fast, desperate, wrong. Eleanor's fingers found the rifle's stock as she rose to her feet, eyes scanning the darkening landscape. A single rider emerged from the rocky trail that wound down from the mesa, moving erratically, the horse stumbling, the figure in the saddle swaying like a drunkard or wounded, Eleanor whispered to herself. Her first instinct was to retreat inside, bar the door, let whoever it was find help elsewhere. The frontier had taught her that strangers after dark rarely brought good news. They brought violence, the theft, or desperation, often all three. She'd turned away drifters before, refused shelter to men whose eyes held too much hunger or too little truth. But this rider wasn't heading toward her house with purpose. The horse was carrying its burden on instinct alone, seeking the only light and structure visible for miles. As they drew closer, Eleanor could see the dark stain spreading across the rider's left shoulder, the way his head dropped forward, consciousness slipping. The horse stopped 10 feet from her porch, sides heaving, foam at its mouth. The rider began to slide from the saddle. Eleanor moved without thinking, a muscle memory from years of frontier emergencies overriding her caution. She caught him before he hit the ground, his weight nearly taking them both down. He was young, maybe 28 or 30, with dark hair matted with sweat and dust. Blood soaked through his shirt, warm and sticky against her hands. His eyes opened, gray as storm clouds, sharp despite the pain. "Ma'am," he managed, voice rough as gravel. "I apologize for the intrusion." Even bleeding out, he had manners. Eleanor wasn't sure if that made him more trustworthy or more dangerous. Polite men could be the worst kind of liars. "You've been shot," she said flatly. Astute observation. A ghost of a smile flickered across his face, then vanished as pain lanced through him. "I don't suppose you're in the charity business." Eleanor should have said no, should have pointed him toward Copper Ridge, wished him luck, sent him on his way. Instead, she found herself looking into those steady gray eyes, and seen something that reminded her achingly of Thomas. Not his appearance, but that quality of quiet endurance, of someone who'd been broken by the world but refused to shatter completely. "One night," she heard herself say, "you can stay one night. Come morning, you ride out and don't come back." "Fair terms." His voice was fading, consciousness slipping. "You're kinder than you pretend, ma'am." "Don't make me regret it," Eleanor muttered. Getting him inside proved nearly impossible. He was solid muscle beneath the blood and trail dust, easily 6 feet tall and built like someone who'd spent his life working cattle or breaking horses. Eleanor managed to half drag, half walk him through her door and onto the narrow bed in what had once been a guest room and was now mostly storage. She lit the oil lamp, and in the flickering light the full extent of his injury became clear. Gunshot wound, high on the left shoulder. The bullet had passed clean through. She could see both entry and exit wounds. That was fortunate. Digging out bullets without proper tools or medical training was how you killed men faster than the lead itself. But the bleeding hadn't stopped, and infection was always the real killer on the frontier. Eleanor had done this before. Patched up Thomas after a dozen ranch accidents, tended to sick horses and injured cattle. Human flesh wasn't so different. She heated water, gathered clean cloth, retrieved the bottle of whiskey she kept for medicinal purposes. The stranger had passed out completely by the time she returned. Working quickly, Eleanor cleaned the wounds, packed them with cloth soaked in whiskey, and wrapped his shoulder tight enough to slow the bleeding without cutting off circulation. His breathing stayed steady throughout, a good sign. Men who went into shock or fever this quickly rarely survived the night. She sat back studying him in the lamplight. Young, but weathered. His hands were calloused, scarred. Working hands, not a gambler's or a banker's. His clothes were worn but well made, the kind a cowboy might invest in if he had steady employment and some pride. The gun belt hanging on her chair was quality leather, the revolver clean and maintained but not fancy. Not a showpiece. A tool. Everything about him suggested an ordinary ranch hand who'd found himself in extraordinary trouble. But men didn't ride alone through the desert at night with gunshot wounds because their lives were ordinary. Eleanor checked his pulse one final time, then retreated to her own room across the hall, leaving both doors open and the rifle within arm's reach. Sleep would be difficult tonight. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, no matter what her instincts whispered about steady gray eyes and courteous words. The desert wind rattled her windows, and somewhere in the darkness, that coyote called out again. Morning arrived with brutal efficiency. Eleanor woke before dawn as always, her body trained by decades of ranch life to rise when the world was still dark. She checked on the stranger first, still unconscious but breathing normally, no fever yet. She changed his bandages, noting with grim satisfaction that the bleeding had mostly stopped. Then she returned to her routine because routine was survival. The horses needed feeding, the chicken coop required cleaning, and the water pump had been making concerning noises for 3 days. Problems didn't pause for mysterious wounded strangers. She was hauling feed to the stable when she heard movement behind her. Eleanor spun, hand instinctively reaching for the knife at her belt. The stranger stood in her doorway, leaning heavily against the frame, his left arm bound tight against his chest. He looked terrible, pale beneath several days of stubble, dark circles under those gray eyes. But he was upright and conscious. "You should be in bed," Eleanor said sharply. "Probably." He managed a weak smile. "But I've learned that staying horizontal makes you vulnerable. Easier to defend yourself on your feet. Who's coming after you?" The smile faded. "That's a fair question you have every right to ask. But the answer's complicated, ma'am, and I'd rather not burden you with details that might make you complicit." "Complicit in what?" "Troubles that aren't yours." He straightened slightly, though the effort cost him. "I gave you my word I'd leave this morning. I intend to keep it. Just need to gather my strength, and I'll be gone." Eleanor studied him for a long moment. Every piece of practical wisdom she'd accumulated screamed at her to accept this offer, to watch him ride away and forget he'd ever darkened her doorway. Clean break, no complications. Instead, she heard herself say, "You can barely stand. You'll be dead by noon if you ride out in that condition." "I've survived worse odds." "That's not the point." She set down the feed bucket with more force than necessary, frustration rising. Look, I don't know what you're running from, and I don't particularly care, but I'm not going to patch a man up just to watch him kill himself through stubbornness. You can stay until you're strong enough to actually survive the ride to Copper Ridge. A few more days, maybe. He shook his head slowly. Ma'am, you don't understand. Don't I? Eleanor cut him off, years of accumulated anger suddenly finding a target. You think I don't recognize trouble when it collapses on my doorstep? I've lived in this territory for 23 years. I've seen range wars, outlaw gangs, land disputes that ended in blood. I know exactly what kind of danger you probably represent. Then why help me at all? The question hung in the cold morning air. Eleanor didn't have a good answer, or rather, she had too many answers and none of them made sense when examined closely. Because she was lonely. Because he had kind eyes despite the danger. Because some part of her that she'd thought died with Thomas apparently still believed in second chances and human decency. Because, she said finally, the desert's already too full of death. I don't need to add to the count. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or gratitude, or recognition of a kindred spirit who understood loss and survival in equal measure. Caleb, he said quietly, my name's Caleb Rourke. Eleanor Whitaker. She picked up the feed bucket again. You want to stay? You work. I don't run a charity operation, Mr. Rourke. Can you split wood with one arm? A genuine smile this time. I can try. Caleb Rourke proved to be either the most determined man Eleanor had ever met or the most foolish. Despite the gunshot wound that should have kept him bedridden for a week, he insisted on making himself useful. The first day, he managed to split wood for maybe 20 minutes before exhaustion and pain forced him back inside. The second day, he lasted an hour. By the third day, he was working alongside Eleanor for most of the morning, moving slower than normal, but moving. They fell into an unexpected rhythm. Eleanor would start the day with the horses, her private time, the meditation of feeding and grooming that connected her to the ranch's heartbeat. Caleb would tackle whatever physical task he could manage one-handed, splitting firewood, organizing the barn, repairing fence posts close to the house. Around midday, they'd break for a simple meal, usually eaten in silence or punctuated by brief, practical exchanges about ranch work. But as the days passed, the silences grew more comfortable and the conversations stretched longer. You built this place yourself? Caleb asked on the fourth day, examining the solid construction of the barn with professional appreciation. My husband did, Thomas. Eleanor's voice remained steady, but something in her chest tightened at the name. He had a gift for building things that lasted. Past tense. He died 11 years ago. Flash flood during monsoon season. Horse threw him. Current took them both. Caleb was quiet for a moment, then said simply, I'm sorry. Not the usual platitudes about time healing or God's plan, just genuine acknowledgement of loss. Eleanor appreciated that more than she could articulate. You run this whole operation alone? Caleb continued, gesturing at the sprawling property, corrals, stable, storage sheds, the main house, and beyond it all, the grazing land that stretched toward the distant mesas. Mostly. I hire hands sometimes during roundup or when the work gets too heavy, but I've learned to manage. That's not managing, ma'am. That's surviving. There's a difference. Eleanor turned to look at him sharply. And you'd know about survival, would you? Caleb met her gaze without flinching. Some. My family had a ranch up in Colorado Territory, lost it 6 years back when the bank called in loans we couldn't pay. My father put a gun in his mouth rather than face the shame. My mother died 2 winters later, grief, the doctor said, but I think she just gave up. My sister married a rancher in Wyoming and made it clear I wasn't welcome to complicate her new life. The stark honesty of it hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She'd learned that frontier people rarely spoke so openly about their wounds. Everyone carried tragedy, and dwelling on it was considered weakness or self-pity. So you've been drifting, Eleanor said. 6 years of following cattle work, breaking horses, doing whatever needed doing. Caleb returned his attention to the fence post he was attempting to secure. Picked up skills, lost illusions, learned that home isn't a place you can necessarily go back to. No, Eleanor agreed quietly. I suppose it isn't. They worked in silence for a while, the desert sun climbing toward its midday apex. Eleanor found herself watching Caleb from the corner of her eye, the careful way he moved to protect his injured shoulder, the unconscious competence in how he approached each task, the quiet pride that kept him working despite obvious pain. He reminded her of Thomas, but not in appearance, in something deeper, that quality of endurance, of men who'd been knocked down by life but kept getting back up because the alternative was surrender, and surrender meant death. "Why are you really here, Mr. Rourke?" Eleanor asked suddenly. Caleb paused, hammer in hand, not looking at her. "You mean, why was I shot?" "I mean, why did you ride toward my ranch instead of toward town? There are closer properties, places with more help, better resources." Is there a good answer to that question? The truth would suffice. Caleb set down the hammer, finally turning to face her fully. His gray eyes were serious, assessing, as if deciding how much honesty she could handle. "I saw your lights from the Mesa Trail," he said. "Single house, isolated, managed by someone who clearly values privacy given the location. I figured—" He paused, choosing words carefully. "I figured someone living alone that far from town had their own reasons for avoiding attention. Might be more sympathetic to a man in trouble than good citizens who'd immediately involve the law." "You were running from the law?" "Running from men who use the law when it suits them and ignore it when it doesn't." Bitterness edged his voice. "I made the mistake of being in the wrong place when powerful people wanted a scapegoat. The badge means protection for some folks and a target for others. I've learned which category I fall into." Eleanor considered this, her innate caution warring with growing instinct that Caleb was telling the truth, or at least his version of it. "And the gunshot?" 3 men caught up with me on the Mesa Trail 2 nights back. They wanted to make sure I didn't make it to the territorial marshal to tell my side of things. I got lucky, killed one, wounded another, the 3rd ran. But not before one of them tagged me. He gestured to his shoulder. I rode through the night trying to put distance between me and whoever else they might send. Your ranch was the first shelter I found. You killed a man. Eleanor stated it flatly, without judgment, but needing confirmation. I did. Clean shot, center mass, no hesitation. Caleb's voice remained steady. He was trying to kill me, ma'am. I don't lose sleep over defending my life. But you do lose sleep over something. Eleanor had seen it in the way he startled awake at odd hours, the way his hand sometimes drifted toward where his gun belt hung on the chair, even in sleep. Caleb's jaw tightened. For a moment, Eleanor thought he wouldn't answer, that she'd pushed too far into territory he wasn't willing to share. Then he said, "I lose sleep wondering if I'll ever stop running. If there's anywhere left in this territory where a man can start over without his past riding him down. I'm 29 years old, Mrs. Whitaker, and I'm tired of drifting, but the world doesn't seem inclined to let people like me settle." The raw honesty in his voice resonated with something deep in Eleanor's chest, that same exhaustion, that same longing for peace that felt perpetually out of reach. "People like you," she repeated softly. "And what kind of person are you, Mr. Rourke?" He looked at her for a long moment, those gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "The kind who's made mistakes but tries to do right when given the chance," he said. "The kind who works hard, keeps his word, and doesn't ask for more than he's earned. The kind who's been beaten down by circumstances but hasn't turned mean or given up. The kind who—" He paused, something vulnerable flickering across his features. "The kind who saw a woman brave enough to live alone in the desert and thought maybe, if I could be half that strong, I'd be worth something after all." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, a sensation so unfamiliar after years of solitude that it took her a moment to recognize it as a blush. "Flattery won't get you out of fence work," she said, more sharply than intended, using sternness to cover sudden confusion. Caleb's smile was gentle, knowing. "Wouldn't dream of trying, ma'am." He returned to the fence post, and Eleanor busied herself checking the water trough, her heart beating faster than the mild exertion warranted. Dangerous, she thought. Not because Caleb posed a physical threat, she was increasingly certain he didn't, but because something about him made her feel things she'd buried with Thomas. Made her remember what it was like to have a partner, to share burdens and small moments, to feel seen by someone who understood the weight of survival. She was 57 years old, too old for foolishness, too experienced to mistake loneliness for connection. And yet, the fifth evening brought unexpected rain. It started as distant thunder rumbling over the mesas, then clouds gathering with unusual speed, darkening the sky to bruised purple. Eleanor had lived in Arizona long enough to recognize the signs of a serious desert storm, the kind that could drop months' worth of rain in a single violent hour. "We need to secure everything," she told Caleb, already moving toward the barn. "Horses inside, shutters closed. Anything that can blow away needs to be tied down or brought in." They worked frantically as the first fat drops began to fall, quickly turning into a downpour that hammered the dry earth like divine percussion. Lightning split the sky in brilliant white forks, thunder following seconds later, close, getting closer. By the time they'd finished and retreated to the house, both were soaked through. Eleanor grabbed towels from the storage chest, tossing one to Caleb. "You should change that bandage. Can't risk infection from dirty water." "I can manage. Don't be stubborn. Sit." To her surprise, he obeyed without further protest, settling into the chair by the fireplace, while Eleanor retrieved fresh bandages and the medical supplies that had become familiar over the past few days. The intimacy of unwrapping the old bandages, examining the healing wound in the firelight, became suddenly acute. They were alone in a house miles from anywhere, rain hammering the roof, the world reduced to this warm circle of light and the space between their breathing. Eleanor focused on the practical task. The wound was healing well, no signs of infection, the flesh knitting together with the resilience of youth. Caleb's shoulder was solid muscle beneath her fingers, his skin warm despite the cold rain. "You've done this before," Caleb observed quietly. "Patched wounds? Yes. Ranching isn't gentle work." "I meant cared for someone." His voice was soft, almost hesitant. "There's a tenderness in how you work, like you're used to caring." Eleanor's hands stilled briefly, then continued wrapping the fresh bandage. "I was married for 12 years, Mr. Rourke. You learn to tend the people you—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Love," Caleb completed gently. The word hung between them like lightning waiting to strike. Eleanor tied off the bandage with more force than necessary, standing abruptly. "That should hold for a few more days. You're healing faster than expected." "Strong constitution." Caleb's eyes hadn't left her face. "Mrs. Whitaker, Eleanor, may I ask you something?" "Depends on the question." "Why are you really out here alone?" He gestured at the house, the ranch beyond. "You're clearly capable of more than survival. You could sell this place, move to town, live somewhere safer and easier. Why stay?" Eleanor walked to the window, watching rain sheet across glass, lightning illuminating the landscape in brief, stark flashes. The truth was complicated, layered in grief and stubbornness and fear. "Because this ranch is all I have left of Thomas," she said finally. "We built it together, suffered together, dreamed together. If I leave, if I sell, then it's like admitting he died for nothing, that those 12 years meant nothing." "Or," Caleb said quietly behind her, "it could mean those 12 years gave you strength and skills and independence, that he'd be proud you survived and became who you are, that honoring his memory doesn't require punishing yourself with isolation." Eleanor turned to face him, something dangerous and desperate rising in her chest. "And what would you know about what Thomas would want? You didn't know him. You don't know me. You're a drifter who will be gone in a few days, back to running from whatever trouble you've brought to my doorstep." She regretted the words immediately, saw them land like physical blows, saw Caleb's expression close down, walls slamming back into place. "You're right," he said evenly, standing. "I apologize for overstepping. It won't happen again." He moved toward the guest room, and Eleanor felt panic flutter beneath her ribs. The same panic that came in the deep night when she woke to absolute silence and thought, "This is it. This is the rest of my life. Alone until I die." "Caleb, wait." He paused at the doorway but didn't turn. Eleanor struggled for words, for honesty, for courage she wasn't sure she possessed. I apologize. You didn't deserve that. You've been nothing but helpful and respectful, and I repaid you with cruelty." "You repaid me by saving my life," Caleb corrected quietly. Everything after that is grace I don't deserve. Why do you think you don't deserve it? Now he did turn, and the vulnerability in his eyes nearly broke her heart. Because I've spent 6 years losing everything I cared about. Family, home, purpose. Because somewhere along the way I started believing I was the problem, that I brought the destruction with me like a plague, because thunder cracked directly overhead, loud enough to shake the windows, and they both flinched. But Caleb didn't look away. Because when I look at you, he continued, voice rough with emotion, I see everything I thought I'd lost forever. Strength and dignity and the courage to keep building even when the world tears down. And it terrifies me that I might care about that, about you, when I have nothing to offer except more trouble and an uncertain future. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. I'm 57 years old. I know. You're young enough to be my... She hesitated, doing the math. Certainly much younger. I know that too. Then you're a fool. Caleb smiled, sad, knowing, achingly tender. Probably, but I've been a fool in worse ways, for worse reasons. The rain hammered harder, the storm reaching its peak fury. Lightning turned the world white, and in that frozen moment of illumination, Eleanor saw the truth she'd been avoiding since the night Caleb rode into her yard. She was lonely, desperately, achingly lonely in ways she'd refused to acknowledge for 11 years. And this wounded stranger with his steady eyes and careful honesty had somehow slipped past every defense she'd constructed, had reminded her what it felt like to be seen, to be cared for, to matter to another human being. It was foolish, dangerous, completely illogical. And in that moment, Eleanor didn't care. I'm too old for this, she whispered, but she was moving toward him even as she said it. Then we're both fools, Caleb said, meeting her halfway. His hand came up to her face, calloused and gentle, and Eleanor leaned into the touch with a hunger that shocked her. How long had it been since anyone had touched her with tenderness instead of transaction? How many years since she'd allowed herself to be vulnerable? If we do this, she said, voice shaking, I can't promise anything beyond tonight. I can't promise safety or a future or... Eleanor. Caleb's thumb traced her cheekbone, his eyes holding hers with devastating honesty. I'm not asking for promises. I'm asking for now, for this moment, for permission to care about someone who deserves to be cared for. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, Eleanor Whitaker finally stopped fighting the storm in her own heart. She kissed him. It was tentative at first, unfamiliar after so many years alone. But Caleb responded with careful passion, one hand cradling her face, the other wrapped gently around her waist, mindful of his injured shoulder. Eleanor's hands found his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him, the reality of another human being choosing her, wanting her, despite age and circumstance and all the practical reasons this was impossible. They broke apart, breathing hard, foreheads resting together. I don't know what I'm doing, Eleanor confessed. Neither do I. Caleb's smile was visible in his voice. But I'm willing to figure it out if you are. Thunder rolled across the sky, and Eleanor thought about all the years she'd spent locked away in grief and isolation, convinced that safety meant solitude, that protecting her heart required closing it completely. What if she was wrong? What if the real courage wasn't in surviving alone but in risking connection even when loss seemed inevitable? Stay, she said, the word a plea and a prayer and a promise all at once. Not just until you heal. Stay. Caleb's eyes widened, surprise and hope and fear flickering across his features. Eleanor, you don't know what you're asking. The men chasing me will come or they won't. Trouble finds us or it doesn't. She gripped his shirt, holding him close. I've spent 11 years preparing for every disaster except the disaster of dying alone, having never tried again, having never opened my heart to possibility. I'm done with that version of survival. I have nothing to offer you, Caleb said desperately. No property, no money, no guarantees. You have yourself, your strength, your character, your willingness to work and to care. Eleanor's voice grew stronger, more certain. That's everything I need. Lightning flashed again, illuminating them in electric white, two people clinging to each other against the storm and the darkness and the uncertainty of tomorrow. Caleb kissed her again, deeper this time, and Eleanor felt something unlock in her chest, something she'd thought permanently sealed after Thomas's death. Not replacement love, not forgetting, but space for something new, something unexpected, something that honored what she'd had while embracing what might still be possible. They moved to her bedroom without discussion, without hesitation, the rain their soundtrack and the lightning their witness. Making love after 11 years of abstinence was awkward and tender and surprisingly joyful. Caleb was patient with her self-consciousness about her aging body. Eleanor was careful with his injured shoulder. They laughed when they bumped heads, gasped when pleasure unexpectedly overwhelmed, held each other afterward in trembling silence as the storm gradually diminished outside. "I'm scared," Eleanor admitted into the darkness, her head on Caleb's chest, listening to his heartbeat steady and strong. "Of what?" "That this is a dream, that you'll disappear, that I'm too old to start over and this will end in heartbreak." Caleb's arms tightened around her. "I'm scared too, that I'll bring disaster down on you, that I'm not good enough, strong enough, worthy enough, that the universe will punish me for daring to want happiness. Then we're both terrified fools." "Seems like it." Eleanor lifted her head to look at him in the dim firelight filtering through the doorway. "But we're trying anyway?" Caleb's smile was achingly genuine. "We're trying anyway." She settled back against his chest, listening to rain gentle into steady percussion, feeling the warmth of another human being beside her for the first time in over a decade. Tomorrow would bring practical concerns, questions about Caleb's past, decisions about the ranch's future, the looming threat of whoever might still be hunting him. Tomorrow would demand plans and preparations and all the careful thinking she'd set aside in tonight's storm of emotion. But tonight, Eleanor chose possibility over fear. Tonight, the lonely ranch felt like a home again. And in the darkness, as sleep finally claimed them both, Eleanor whispered a truth she'd never expected to speak again. "Thank you for staying." Caleb's response was a kiss pressed to her hair, gentle as rain, and a whispered promise that felt like hope. "Thank you for letting me." The storm passed, the desert drank deep, and two wounded souls began the fragile work of healing together, one careful breath at a time. End of part 1. Dawn broke with the peculiar clarity that only follows desert storms. The air scrubbed clean, colors sharp enough to cut, the whole world looking newly made. Eleanor woke to unfamiliar warmth beside her, and for one disorienting moment thought she'd traveled backward through time, that Thomas lay sleeping next to her as he had for 12 years. Then Caleb stirred, his injured shoulder causing him to wince even in sleep, and reality crashed back with all its complicated weight. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. Eleanor slipped from bed carefully, not wanting to wake him, and dressed in the pre-dawn darkness with hands that trembled slightly. In the kitchen, she built up the fire and set coffee to brewing, her mind racing through everything that had changed in one storm-filled night. What had she been thinking? She was 57 years old, a widow who'd built a life based on independence and caution, and she'd just invited a man she'd known for less than a week to stay indefinitely. A man running from violence and trouble, a man young enough that people would talk, a man who might disappear the moment something better came along. Except none of that matched what she'd seen in Caleb's eyes last night. None of it explained the careful tenderness with which he'd touched her, the vulnerability he'd shown, the way he'd looked at her like she was something precious rather than convenient. "You're overthinking." Eleanor jumped, coffee sloshing over the rim of her cup. Caleb stood in the doorway, dressed but barefoot, his dark hair disheveled and a half-smile playing at his lips. "I'm being practical," Eleanor countered, wiping up the spilled coffee with more vigor than necessary. "That what we're calling regret these days?" "I didn't say I regretted anything." You didn't have to. It's written all over your face." Caleb crossed to the stove, pouring himself coffee with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged here. "You're wondering what possessed you to let a drifter into your bed in your life. You're cataloging every reason this is a terrible idea. You're already planning how to walk it back." Eleanor bristled at being read so easily. "And if I am?" "Then I'd understand completely." Caleb met her eyes over the rim of his cup. "Last night was intense. Things were said, Decisions were made in the heat of the moment. If you want to pretend it never happened, send me on my way come morning. I won't hold it against you. That's not... Eleanor stopped, frustrated with herself and him, and the whole situation. I don't know what I want. Fair enough. Caleb set down his cup, his expression growing serious. Then let me tell you what I want. I want to stay. I want to work this ranch alongside you. I want to earn the trust and the second chance you offered last night. I want to see where this goes between us without pressure or expectations beyond honest effort. And when your past catches up, when those men come looking, then we deal with it together. His voice was steady, certain. I won't lie to you, Eleanor. Trouble might be coming, but I'm done running. I'm done letting fear dictate every choice. If this is the place I make my stand, then so be it. Eleanor studied him in the growing light, this man who'd appeared out of nowhere and somehow cracked open the fortress she'd built around her heart. Everything sensible said to protect herself, to maintain distance, to not risk the pain of loss again. But when had sensible ever led to anything except loneliness? There are rules, she heard herself say. Hope flickered across Caleb's face. I'm listening. You work, not as a guest or a charity case, but as a full partner in running this ranch. That means hard days, difficult decisions, and carrying your weight. Agreed. You're honest with me. About your past, about what might be coming, about what you're thinking and feeling. No secrets that could put either of us in danger. That's fair. And if this doesn't work, if we realize we've made a mistake, or if circumstances change, we address it like adults. No sneaking off in the night, no dramatic exits. We talk. Caleb extended his hand, formal as a business contract. You have my word on all of it. Eleanor shook his hand, the simple gesture somehow more binding than any vow. His grip was warm, calloused, solid, real. All right then, she said, releasing his hand with some reluctance. Welcome to the Whitaker Ranch, Mr. Rourke. Your first task is helping me check for storm damage. Desert rains can be destructive as hell when they finally come. The relief and gratitude in Caleb's smile made her chest tighten. Yes, ma'am. Let me get my boots. They spent the morning surveying the property, cataloging damage and necessary repairs. The storm had been fierce but brief. One fence section completely washed out, part of the barn's roof peeled back, the chicken coop flooded, and half the vegetable garden drowned. Significant work, but nothing catastrophic. Working alongside Caleb felt different now. There was an ease between them, a comfortable rhythm as they divided tasks and coordinated efforts. He deferred to her expertise on ranch matters while offering insights from his own experience. They moved around each other with growing synchronization, two people learning the dance of partnership. By midday, they'd made enough progress to justify a break. Eleanor prepared a simple lunch while Caleb washed up at the pump, and they ate on the porch in companionable near silence. Tell me about Colorado, Eleanor said finally, curious about the life Caleb had lost. His expression clouded briefly, then settled into something more neutral, not quite comfortable with the topic, but willing to share. Mountain country, beautiful in ways the desert isn't. Green valleys, pine forests, snow-capped peaks. Our ranch sat in a valley near a town called Silver Creek. What happened to it? Bad winters. Disease took half the herd in '78. Prices dropped when the railroad changed routes, and we lost our best shipping access. My father took loans he couldn't repay, made deals with men who didn't forgive debt. Caleb's jaw tightened. By the end, we owed more than the land was worth. Bank foreclosed. We had 30 days to vacate. And your father chose death over starting over. He chose what felt like the only option left to a man who'd failed his family. Bitterness edged Caleb's voice. Never mind that my mother needed him, that I needed him. Pride mattered more than survival. Eleanor heard the unresolved anger beneath the words, the wound that hadn't healed even after 6 years. You're still angry at him. Every damn day. Caleb set down his half-eaten sandwich, appetite apparently gone. Because he took the coward's way out and left us to clean up the mess. Because he taught me that failure meant death rather than adaptation. Because I spent years wondering if I'd do the same thing when my turn came to face impossible odds. And would you? No? The answer came immediately, fierce with conviction. I learned from his mistake. Survival isn't cowardice, starting over isn't failure. Living to fight another day takes more courage than dying for pride. Eleanor reached across the space between them, covering his hand with hers. I'm glad you learned that lesson. Otherwise, you might not have ridden toward my lights that night. Caleb turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers. Best decision I ever made, even if I was half dead at the time. They sat like that for a while, hands clasped, watching the desert shimmer in afternoon heat. It felt impossibly domestic, impossibly right, and Eleanor tried not to think about how fragile this peace might prove. My turn, Caleb said eventually. Tell me about Thomas. Eleanor had expected the question, but still wasn't prepared for the complicated emotions it stirred. What do you want to know? Whatever you're willing to share. I'm not asking you to forget him or pretend he didn't exist, but if we're building something here, I'd like to understand the man who came before me. It was sensitively put, and Eleanor appreciated the careful respect in Caleb's tone. She gathered her thoughts, sifting through 12 years of memories for the truth beneath the mythology. Thomas was solid, she said finally. Dependable, hardworking, honest to a fault. He had a vision for this ranch and the determination to make it real. When I met him, I was working in a boarding house in Tucson, saving money to return east. He convinced me the frontier held more opportunity than Boston ever would. Was he right? In some ways, we built something real here, something that lasted beyond his death. But it cost us too, the isolation, the hardship, the constant struggle. Some days I wonder if a smaller dream might have kept him alive longer. You can't think like that, Caleb said gently. Men die on easy streets and safe roads just as surely as they die in flash floods. At least Thomas died building something he believed in. Maybe, Eleanor sighed, the old grief settling over her shoulders like a familiar shawl. But he left me alone with a ranch too big for one person, and debts it took years to clear. Some days the resentment outweighs the loss, and I hate myself for feeling that way. That's human, not hateful. You can love someone and still be angry they abandoned you. The simple acceptance in those words unlocked something in Eleanor's chest. How many years had she carried guilt over her mixed feelings about Thomas's death? How often had she berated herself for anger that felt like betrayal? He wasn't perfect, she admitted. Thomas could be stubborn, dismissive of my ideas, convinced his way was the only way. We fought about money, about taking risks, about whether to hire more help. But we also laughed together. Worked side by side for 12 years. Built this place from nothing but determination and sweat. Do you miss him? Every day. But not the way I did at first. Eleanor struggled to articulate something she'd never put into words before. At first, the grief was everything. Drowning, consuming, absolute. I couldn't imagine existing without him, but slowly it changed into something more like absence. A Thomas-shaped hole in my life that I learned to work around. And lately, she trailed off, uncertain how to finish. Lately, Caleb prompted. Lately, I've started to wonder if holding on to that absence was easier than risking its replacement, if I used grief as a shield against vulnerability. Caleb was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. And now? Now I'm terrified, Eleanor admitted. Because I'm risking that vulnerability with you, and I don't know if I'm strong enough to survive being wrong about someone again. You're strong enough to survive anything, Caleb said with quiet certainty. You've already proven that. The question isn't strength, it's whether you're willing to risk your heart on possibility instead of protecting it with certainty. Eleanor looked at their joined hands, struck by the simple profundity of the gesture. This was possibility. This connection, fragile and new, built on honesty and mutual wounds, and the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, second chances were real. I'm willing, she said softly. Scared, but willing. Caleb lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with old-fashioned gallantry that made her heart skip. Then we're well matched, because I'm terrified too. But I'd rather be scared and trying than safe and alone. The moment stretched between them, sweet and tentative, until a sound from the distance shattered it completely. Hoofbeats. Multiple riders, coming fast. Caleb was on his feet instantly, every muscle tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun belt he'd left inside. How many people know about this ranch? Not many. I don't get visitors often. Eleanor's heart hammered as she stood, shading her eyes to see riders emerging from the trail, 3 of them, riding hard, purpose in their approach. "Inside! Now!" Caleb's voice had gone hard, dangerous. "Get your rifle and stay out of sight. This is my property. And these might be the men who shot me." He met her eyes, intensity blazing. "Please, Eleanor, trust me on this." She hesitated only a moment before nodding and retreating into the house, grabbing her rifle from above the doorframe. Through the window, she watched Caleb position himself on the porch, unarmed but ready, as the riders approached. They reined up 20 feet from the house, 3 hard-looking men in trail dust and leather, guns visible on their hips. The lead rider was older, maybe 45, with a thick mustache and eyes that assessed Caleb with professional calculation. "Help you, gentlemen?" Caleb's voice was level, giving nothing away. "Looking for someone," the lead rider said. His accent marked him as Texas-born. His bearing suggested military or law enforcement background. "Young cowboy, dark hair, riding a bay mare with a blaze. Might have come through here a few days back, possibly injured." "A lot of cowboys in Arizona territory," Caleb said. "You'll have to be more specific. This one's wanted for questioning in connection with a bank robbery up in Prescott. Name's Caleb Rourke." The rider's hand drifted casually toward his gun. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Eleanor's blood ran cold. Bank robbery. The words changed everything, recolored every conversation she'd had with Caleb, made her feel foolish and naive for believing his story about defending himself from persecution. She waited for Caleb to lie, to deny, to run. Instead, he straightened his shoulders and said calmly, "I'm Caleb Rourke, and I didn't rob any bank." The lead rider smiled without humor. "That's for the law to decide, son. You're going to need to come with us." "You law?" "Federal marshals." The rider pulled back his coat to reveal a badge. "Marshal Wade Cooper. These are Deputies Hayes and Sullivan. You're under arrest pending investigation into the Prescott Bank incident." Eleanor's mind raced. Federal marshals were legitimate law enforcement, not the vengeful gunmen Caleb had described, which meant either Caleb had lied about everything or the situation was more complicated than he'd explained. "What's the charge specifically?" Caleb asked, still calm, still standing his ground. "Accessory to robbery and murder. 3 men hit the Prescott Bank and Trust 2 weeks ago. 2 got away with $15,000. Third man, your partner, we suspect, was shot dead by a clerk. Witnesses placed you outside holding horses." Witnesses were wrong. Again, that's for a judge to determine. Marshal Cooper's patience was clearly thinning. "Now you can come peaceful, or we can make this difficult. Your choice." Caleb's jaw tightened, and Eleanor could see him calculating options, all of them bad. If he ran, he'd confirm their suspicions. If he fought, he'd be killed or captured anyway. If he surrendered, he'd face trial for crimes he claimed he didn't commit. Eleanor made a decision that was either the bravest or most foolish of her life. She stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand but pointed down, positioning herself beside Caleb. "Marshal Cooper," she said, voice steady despite her hammering heart. "I'm Eleanor Whitaker, owner of this property. Mr. Rourke has been working for me this past week recovering from injuries. If you're taking him, I'm coming along to ensure he's treated fairly." The marshal's eyebrows rose. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you." "It concerns me when armed men ride onto my land making accusations against someone under my protection." "Your protection," Marshal Cooper's tone suggested he found this amusing. "Ma'am, do you understand this man is suspected of serious crimes?" "I understand you suspect him. I also understand that suspicion isn't conviction." Eleanor's years of dealing with difficult ranchers, stubborn merchants, and condescending town officials gave her voice and authority that made the marshal reconsider his dismissive attitude. "Even so, Mr. Rourke has been here with me for 6 days, Eleanor continued. "During that time, he's worked hard, behaved honorably, and given me no reason to doubt his character. If he's to face charges, he deserves proper representation and fair treatment. As the only witness to his whereabouts this past week, my testimony will be relevant to his case." She could feel Caleb staring at her in astonishment, but she kept her eyes on the marshal, refusing to back down. Marshal Cooper studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "Mrs. Whitaker, I appreciate your concern for due process, but this man is coming with us regardless. What you do after that is your business. Then I'll be riding to Copper Ridge tomorrow to speak with the territorial judge about legal representation. That's your right. The marshal returned his attention to Caleb. Mr. Rourke, you'll need to surrender any weapons and come with us now. Caleb looked at Eleanor, a dozen emotions flickering across his face. Gratitude, regret, fear, something that might have been love. Go inside and get my gun belt, he said quietly. And Eleanor, thank you for everything. This isn't over, Eleanor said fiercely. I meant what I said. I'll find you a lawyer, testify if needed, fight this however I can. Why? The question was barely a whisper. You barely know me. This could all be true. Because I choose to believe in second chances, and because you've given me no reason to doubt your word. She held his gaze, willing him to understand. That counts for something? Caleb's throat worked, emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Then he nodded once, sharply, and turned back to the marshals. I'll come peacefully, no trouble. Eleanor retrieved his gun belt, watching as one of the deputies dismounted to shackle Caleb's wrists. The sight of iron around his wrists, of him being treated like a criminal, made rage and helplessness boil in her chest. Marshal Cooper tipped his hat to Eleanor. Ma'am, for what it's worth, I hope you're right about him. But the law requires we investigate thoroughly. He'll be held in Copper Ridge pending trial. I understand, Marshal, and I'll be visiting him tomorrow. They helped Caleb mount one of their horses, and Eleanor stood on her porch watching as they rode away, her new partner in shackles, her fragile hope for a different future disappearing into desert dust. Only when they were completely out of sight did she allow herself to sink onto the porch step, rifle across her knees, tears of frustration burning her eyes. She'd opened her heart for the first time in 11 years, and the desert had taken again, as it always did. But this time, Eleanor Whitaker wasn't surrendering to loss without a fight. The next morning found Eleanor on the trail to Copper Ridge, riding with grim determination and a saddlebag full of silver coins she'd been saving for emergencies. If this wasn't an emergency, nothing was. The 20-mile ride gave her too much time to think, to question every decision she'd made since Caleb rode into her yard. Was she being foolish, naive, blinded by loneliness into trusting a charming liar? But every time doubt crept in, she remembered the vulnerability in Caleb's eyes when he spoke about his father, the careful tenderness with which he'd touched her, the way he'd insisted on working despite his injury rather than taking advantage of her hospitality. Those weren't the actions of a hardened criminal. Those were the actions of a man who'd been knocked down by life, but kept his integrity intact. Copper Ridge sprawled across a valley where 3 trails converged, part mining town, part ranching hub, part way station for travelers heading deeper into the territory. Eleanor had visited monthly for years to trade goods and purchase supplies, but she'd never paid much attention to the town's legal infrastructure beyond knowing the sheriff kept decent order. Now she needed more than the sheriff. She needed someone who understood territorial law and could navigate the complex machinery of frontier justice. The town's only lawyer operated out of a cramped office above the general store, a Massachusetts transplant named Herbert Ashford, who'd come west for his health and stayed for lack of better options. Eleanor had met him once or twice at community gatherings, remembered him as sharp-minded if somewhat pompous. She climbed the narrow stairs and knocked on the door marked H. Ashford, attorney at law. Enter, came a reedy voice. The office was cramped and cluttered with law books, case files, and newspapers from various cities. Herbert Ashford sat behind a desk barely visible beneath paper stacks, a thin man in his early 40s with spectacles and prematurely graying hair. Mrs. Whitaker, he said, rising with surprised courtesy. This is unexpected. How may I assist you? Eleanor laid out the situation with as much clarity as she could manage. Caleb's arrival, his injury, his story about being framed, the marshal's arrest for suspected involvement in bank robbery. She omitted the personal relationship that had developed, keeping her account strictly factual. Ashford listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a pad of paper. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers thoughtfully. This is a complicated case, he said finally. The charges are serious. Accessory to robbery and murder carries significant penalties. potentially including hanging if the prosecution can prove deliberate participation in a capital crime. Eleanor's stomach dropped, but he claims he wasn't involved. Everyone claims innocence, Mrs. Whitaker. The question is what evidence supports or contradicts that claim. Ashford consulted his notes. You say Mr. Rourke told you he was fleeing men who wanted to silence him before he could testify. That suggests he might have been a witness rather than participant. Did he explain what he witnessed? Eleanor realized with growing dismay that she'd never pressed for those details. Not specifically. We discussed his past, his family, but not the exact circumstances of the robbery. Then we need that information before building any defense. Ashford stood, retrieving his hat and coat. I'll visit Mr. Rourke this afternoon at the jail, assess his story, and determine if there's a viable defense. However, Mrs. Whitaker, I must be frank about costs. Legal representation in territorial courts isn't cheap, and a case of this complexity could require weeks of work. How much? At minimum, $200 for initial representation through preliminary hearing. If it goes to full trial, potentially $500 more. $700 total. Eleanor's entire savings amounted to maybe $300, and that was emergency money she couldn't afford to spend completely. But what choice did she have? I can pay $200 now, she said. The rest, I'll find a way. Ashford studied her with an expression that might have been sympathy or calculation. May I ask why you're investing so heavily in a man you've known less than a week? Because he deserves a fair defense. Because I believe him. Because... Eleanor struggled for words that wouldn't reveal too much. Because the frontier grinds people down brutally enough without false accusations adding to the weight. Noble sentiment. Ashford's tone suggested he'd heard similar justifications before, and they rarely ended well. Very well. I'll take the case on your initial payment, but Mrs. Whitaker, I strongly advise you to prepare for disappointment. The law can be capricious, and innocence doesn't always prevail. I understand the risks, Mr. Ashford. Just do your best for him. After paying the retainer and arranging details, Eleanor made her way to the Copper Ridge Jail, a squat adobe building that served double duty as sheriff's office and temporary holding facility. The deputy at the desk recognized her, and after some negotiation, agreed to allow a brief visit. They led her through a narrow corridor to a cell in the back where Caleb sat on a wooden bench, looking haggard but unharmed. His eyes widened when he saw her. Eleanor, you shouldn't have come. Well, I did. She gripped the bars, drinking in the sight of him despite the circumstances. I've hired a lawyer, Herbert Ashford. He'll be visiting you this afternoon to discuss your defense. Caleb stood, moving closer, his hands finding hers through the bars. You didn't have to do that. The expense is mine to worry about. Eleanor squeezed his hands, needing the physical connection. Caleb, I need you to tell me the truth. All of it. What really happened in Prescott? He closed his eyes briefly, then met her gaze with painful honesty. I was working for a ranch outside town, got paid on Friday, went into Prescott Saturday morning to buy supplies and send money to my sister in Wyoming. I was coming out of the telegraph office when I saw 3 men I recognized from the ranch, drifters who'd been hired for a cattle drive the month before. Go on. They were standing near the bank, looking nervous, and one of them was holding horses. 4 horses for 3 men. Wrong configuration unless you're expecting a 4th person. I didn't think much of it until I heard shouting from inside the bank, then gunshots. Eleanor's heart hammered. You witnessed the robbery. Witnessed the aftermath. The 3 men ran out, one of them bleeding badly, carrying sacks that clearly held money. The one holding the horses saw me watching, yelled something to the others. They rode off fast, and Caleb's voice dropped. I made the stupid decision to try and follow them, thinking maybe I could identify where they went, help the law recover the money. That was foolish. Incredibly foolish. He laughed bitterly. I followed for maybe 2 miles before they realized they had a tail. They turned, started shooting. I returned fire in self-defense. The wounded one fell from his horse. I think he was already dying from the bank clerk's shot, but he went down on my watch. The other 2 escaped. And then? Then I panicked. I had a dead man behind me, evidence that I'd been in a gunfight, and no way to prove I wasn't part of the robbery itself. So I did the second stupidest thing possible. I ran instead of going to the law immediately. Eleanor closed her eyes, frustration and understanding warring in her chest. You ran for 2 weeks? Tried to. The two survivors must have spread word I was involved, maybe to deflect attention from themselves. Bounty hunters and opportunists started tracking me. Those 3 men who shot me on the mesa were hired guns looking to collect reward money or silence me before I could contradict the robbery narrative. And the marshals are doing their job. They have witnesses who saw me near the bank and can place me at the scene where the 3rd robber died. Without context, it looks damning. Caleb's grip on her hands tightened. Eleanor, I swear to you on everything I value, I didn't rob that bank. I was a fool who made things worse by running, but I'm not a thief or a murderer. She searched his eyes, looking for deception, for the crack in the story that would confirm her worst fears. But all she saw was desperate honesty and the fear of a man who knew how bad the situation looked. I believe you, she said softly. Relief flooded Caleb's features. Even though it sounds like a convenient excuse? Even though. Because you've had chances to lie, to manipulate, to take advantage, and you haven't. Because your story is too messy and complicated to be fabricated. And because, she paused, then decided honesty deserved honesty. Because I'm choosing to trust my instincts about people, and my instincts say you're telling the truth. Caleb pressed his forehead against the bars, as close to her as the iron allowed. I don't deserve you. Whatever happens, I want you to know, these past days with you have been the best of my life. You gave me hope when I'd forgotten what that felt like. Then fight for it, Eleanor said fiercely. Work with Ashford. Tell him everything. Help him build a defense. Don't give up. And you? I'll do whatever I can from the outside. Testify to your character if needed. Help gather evidence, anything Ashford requires. The deputy called time, and Eleanor forced herself to release Caleb's hands. But before she left, she stood on tiptoe and kissed him through the bars, brief, fierce, full of promise and defiance. This isn't over, she whispered against his lips. We're not over. Promise me something, Caleb said urgently. If this goes badly, if I'm convicted, promise you'll walk away. Don't waste your life visiting a prisoner or waiting for a future that might never come. Promise that. Eleanor, I won't promise to give up on you or us, so don't ask me to. She stepped back, memorizing his face. I'll see you soon. The ride back to the ranch felt longer than the journey in. The desert's beauty turned harsh and unforgiving under her darkening mood. By the time she arrived home, exhaustion and stress had carved deep lines around her eyes. The empty ranch felt impossibly lonely after days of shared occupancy. No Caleb splitting wood in the yard, no sound of his voice calling questions about fence repairs, no presence beside her at the table. Just silence and the weight of uncertainty pressing down like the desert sun. Eleanor forced herself through evening chores, fed the animals, secured the property for night. Then she sat on her porch in the gathering darkness and allowed herself the luxury of tears. For fear and frustration and the cruel timing of finding connection only to have it threatened immediately. But as the stars emerged, sharp and brilliant against the black sky, determination hardened beneath the grief. She'd survived Thomas's death. She'd built a life alone in brutal country. She'd faced drought and debt and isolation without breaking. She could face this too. And she would fight for Caleb's freedom, for justice, for the fragile possibility of happiness they'd barely begun to explore. The desert night surrounded her, vast and indifferent. But Eleanor Whitaker was done being defeated by forces beyond her control. This time, she'd make her own stand. 3 days crawled by with agonizing slowness. Eleanor threw herself into ranch work with manic intensity, repairing storm damage until her hands blistered and her back screamed protest. Physical exhaustion was preferable to the constant churning anxiety about Caleb's fate, about the preliminary hearing scheduled for the following week, about whether justice would prevail or whether the legal machinery would grind an innocent man into dust. On the 4th morning, a rider approached from the east, not the marshals this time, but a weathered rancher named Dutch Carmichael, whose property bordered Eleanor's land to the north. They'd maintained cordial neighbor relations for years, trading equipment and helping with seasonal roundups. Eleanor, Dutch called, reining up near her porch. Heard you had some excitement with federal marshals. Town's buzzing about it. Of course they were. Copper Ridge thrived on gossip like desert plants on rare rain. Eleanor set down the harness she'd been mending and stood, shading her eyes against the morning glare. News travels fast, she said neutrally. Always does. Dutch dismounted, his movements stiff with age and old injuries. He had to be pushing 60, his face carved into deep lines by sun and hardship. They're saying you're harboring bank robbers now. That true? They're saying a lot of things, I imagine, most of it probably nonsense. Dutch studied her with shrewd eyes. That's not a denial. Eleanor debated how much to share, then decided honesty served her better than evasion. A man rode onto my property injured. I gave him shelter and medical attention. The marshals believe he's connected to a bank robbery in Prescott. I believe he's innocent and being blamed for crimes committed by others. You sure about that? Or just hopeful? The blunt question struck closer to Eleanor's doubts than she wanted to admit. Sure enough to hire him a lawyer and testify to his character if needed. Dutch whistled low. That's taking a big risk for a stranger. He's not a stranger anymore. Understanding dawned in Dutch's weathered features, followed by something that looked like concern. Eleanor, I've known you since you and Thomas first settled here. You're one of the toughest, smartest women in this territory, but you're also alone, and that makes you vulnerable to men who might see opportunity in loneliness. Anger flared hot in Eleanor's chest. You think I'm being played? That I'm some foolish old woman taken in by a charming drifter? I think you're human, Dutch said quietly. And humans make bad decisions when they're lonely. I'm not judging, just urging caution. Eleanor forced herself to take a breath, to recognize that Dutch meant well, even if his words stung. I appreciate your concern. Truly. But I've considered all the angles, all the risks. My decision stands. Fair enough. A Dutch retrieved something from his saddlebag, a folded newspaper. Then you should see this. It's yesterday's territorial paper out of Phoenix, has an article about the Prescott robbery. Eleanor took the paper with trembling hands and unfolded it to find a prominent article on the front page. Manhunt concludes in Prescott bank robbery case. Suspect in custody. She read quickly, her heart sinking with each paragraph. The article laid out the robbery in stark detail. 3 masked men entering the Prescott Bank and Trust on a Saturday morning, threatening clerks and customers, making off with $15,000 in cash and bonds. One clerk had grabbed a hidden pistol and shot one of the robbers as they fled. The wounded man had died 2 miles outside town, identified as James Cord, a known associate of outlaw gangs operating throughout the territory. But it was the final paragraphs that made Eleanor's blood run cold. The article quoted anonymous witnesses claiming they'd seen a 4th man, a dark-haired cowboy in his late 20s, holding horses outside the bank and later fleeing north. Federal marshals had tracked this suspect for 2 weeks before apprehending him at a remote ranch in the Southern Territory. The description could fit 1,000 men, but the timing and location made it unmistakably Caleb. Worse, the article mentioned that authorities were investigating possible connections between the suspect and the notorious Cord Brothers gang, which had operated throughout Colorado and New Mexico territories before several members were killed or imprisoned the previous year. This doesn't prove anything, Eleanor said, but her voice lacked conviction. Maybe not legally, Dutch agreed, but in the court of public opinion, he's already convicted. Eleanor, if you keep supporting this man, you're going to face consequences. Social consequences, business consequences. People might stop trading with you, avoid you at market, spread rumors. It could make your life very difficult. Let them. You say that now, but isolation takes a toll. You know that better than anyone. Eleanor folded the newspaper carefully, using the action to gather her thoughts. Dutch wasn't wrong. The social cost could be severe. The frontier operated on reputation and community trust. Align yourself with an accused criminal, and you became suspect by association. But abandoning Caleb to protect her own comfort felt like a betrayal worse than any social consequence. I appreciate the warning, she said finally, and I understand the risks, but I'm not changing course. Dutch sighed, clearly recognizing the futility of further argument. Stubborn as ever. Thomas used to say it was your best and worst quality. He wasn't wrong. If you need anything, and I mean anything that doesn't involve legal troubles or defending accused bank robbers, you know where to find me. Thank you, Dutch. That means more than you know. After he rode away, Eleanor sat on her porch rereading the article, searching for details she might have missed. The reference to the Cord brothers gang troubled her most. If Caleb had connections to known outlaws, his claims of innocence became significantly harder to believe. She needed to talk to Herbert Ashford, needed to understand what this new information meant for the case. The ride to Copper Ridge the next morning revealed Dutch's warnings weren't exaggerated. As Eleanor entered town, she felt the weight of stares and whispered conversations. Women she'd known for years suddenly found reasons to look away. Merchants who usually greeted her warmly became professionally distant. By the time she reached Ashford's office, her jaw ached from clenching and her hands trembled with suppressed anger and hurt. Ashford looked up from his desk as she entered, his expression grave. Mrs. Whitaker. I was about to send word requesting a meeting. I saw the newspaper article, Eleanor said without preamble. Tell me it doesn't change everything. Sit down, please. Ashford gestured to a chair and Eleanor obeyed, bracing herself for bad news. I met with Mr. Rourke yesterday for several hours. His story remains consistent with what he initially told you, but the details are complicated. How complicated? He admits he worked briefly for a ranch that employed James Cord and two other men, the Mallory brothers, Jack and Samuel. This was 3 months ago during a cattle drive from southern Arizona to Prescott. He quit after the drive ended, citing disagreements with the ranch owner over pay. The Mallory brothers and Cord stayed on. Eleanor's stomach churned. So he knew the robbers. Acquaintance, not partnership. There's a significant difference legally. Ashford consulted his notes. However, the prosecution will argue that this prior connection establishes conspiracy. They'll claim Rourke was the inside man who scouted the bank and planned the timing. That's absurd. He was buying supplies and sending money to his sister, which we can potentially prove with telegraph records and merchant receipts. I've already sent inquiries. Ashford removed his spectacles, cleaning them with deliberate care. But Mrs. Whitaker, I must be frank. The evidence against Mr. Rourke is circumstantial but substantial. Witness testimony places him near the scene. His connection to the deceased robber establishes opportunity and motive. His flight, rather than immediate surrender, suggests consciousness of guilt. Or fear of being wrongly accused? That's the argument we'll make. But juries tend to be skeptical of such claims, particularly in cases involving violence and significant theft. Eleanor leaned forward, urgency making her voice sharp. What are his chances, honestly? Ashford was silent for a long moment, weighing his words. If we proceed to trial, perhaps 30% acquittal, 40% conviction on lesser charges, 30% full conviction on all counts. The numbers hit like physical blows. A 70% chance of some level of conviction, with the worst outcome meaning hanging. There must be something we can do, Eleanor insisted. Witnesses who can testify to his character, evidence that contradicts the prosecution's narrative, something. The strongest element in Mr. Rourke's favor is you, Ashford said quietly. A respected rancher willing to vouch for his character carries weight. Your testimony that he arrived injured and desperate, that he worked honestly and behaved honorably, that he showed no signs of wealth or hidden money, all of this creates reasonable doubt. But it's not enough. Not by itself, no. We need more. We need to find the Mallory brothers and prove they're the actual culprits. We need witnesses who can place Rourke definitively away from the bank at the time of the robbery. We need forensic evidence. He stopped, shaking his head. But we're operating in frontier territory with limited resources and time. The preliminary hearing is in 4 days. If the judge finds sufficient cause to proceed to trial, we'll have perhaps 3 weeks to build a comprehensive defense. Then we start now, Eleanor said. Tell me what you need. Over the next hour, they developed a strategy. Ashford would continue building the legal defense while Eleanor would tackle the investigative work, traveling to Prescott to interview witnesses, tracking down anyone who might have seen Caleb at the telegraph office or general store, gathering character references from people who'd worked with him during his 6 years of drifting. It was ambitious, possibly futile, but it gave Eleanor something to focus on besides helpless anxiety. Before leaving, she requested another visit with Caleb. The deputy on duty, a different man than before, younger and notably less friendly, made her wait 20 minutes before grudgingly allowing 5 minutes in the cell area. Caleb looked worse than her previous visit. 4 days in jail had taken visible toll, his face gaunt, shadows under his eyes suggesting sleepless nights, a new tension in his shoulders. Eleanor. Relief flooded his features. I wasn't sure you'd come back. Did you think I'd abandon you? Wouldn't blame you if you did. This situation keeps getting uglier. He moved to the bars, hands reaching through to clasp hers. Ashford told me about the newspaper article, about the town's reaction. You shouldn't have to endure that because of me. Let me decide what I should and shouldn't endure. Eleanor squeezed his hands, needing the contact. We're going to fight this, Caleb. I'm traveling to Prescott to investigate, to find witnesses who can support your story. Alarm flashed across his face. That's a 3-day journey each way, through rough country. It's too dangerous for you to travel alone. I've made that journey before. I can manage. Eleanor, please, the risk is mine to take. She cut him off firmly. You've told me repeatedly that you value honesty and partnership. That means trusting me to make my own decisions about acceptable risk. Caleb opened his mouth to argue further, then closed it, a rueful smile flickering. You're not going to budge on this, are you? Not even slightly. Stubborn woman. You knew that when you decided to stay. Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. Besides, stubbornness is what's kept me alive this long. Might as well put it to good use. If you're determined to go, at least promise you'll be careful. Hire a guide if possible. Stay in populated areas. Don't take unnecessary chances. I promise. Eleanor glanced at the deputy hovering nearby, clearly ready to end the visit. Caleb, I need to know something. Is there anything else you haven't told me? Any other connections or complications that might surface? He met her eyes steadily. I worked for maybe a dozen different ranches these past 6 years. Some of those outfits probably employed men who later turned to crime. That's the reality of frontier labor. You work alongside whoever's hiring, and you don't always know their full history. But I never participated in criminal activity, never knowingly associated with outlaw gangs. What about the Cord brothers' connection? The newspaper mentioned James Cord had 2 brothers, both dead now. One killed in a shootout with Texas Rangers 3 years back, the other hanged for murder in New Mexico. I never met either of them. My only connection to James was 3 weeks working the same cattle drive. Time's up, the deputy announced. Eleanor kissed Caleb quickly through the bars. I'll be back before the preliminary hearing. Keep faith. Eleanor, Caleb's voice stopped her at the door. Whatever happens, thank you. For believing in me, for fighting, for giving me hope. She couldn't speak past the emotion clogging her throat, so she just nodded and left before the tears could fall. The journey to Prescott took 3 hard days of riding through increasingly mountainous terrain as the southern desert gave way to higher elevations and pine forests. Eleanor hired a guide in Copper Ridge, a taciturn Apache tracker named Nasha, who knew the trails and asked no questions about her business. The expense ate into her dwindling savings, but safety outweighed economy. They traveled mostly in silence, Nasha setting a steady pace that ate up miles without exhausting the horses. At night they made simple camps, and Eleanor lay awake under unfamiliar stars, anxiety gnawing at her gut. What if this whole journey proved futile? What if she found no witnesses willing to testify, no evidence to contradict the prosecution's case? But doubt was a luxury she couldn't afford. So she rose each morning, climbed back into the saddle, and pushed forward. Prescott revealed itself gradually as they descended from the mountain passes, a bustling territorial capital with brick buildings, established businesses, and the ordered feel of civilization rather than raw frontier. It was larger than Eleanor expected, prosperity evident in well-maintained streets and numerous establishments. She paid Nasha for the return journey and agreed to meet in 3 days at the same spot. Then she secured a room at a modest boarding house and set about the work that had brought her here. The Prescott Bank and Trust occupied a prominent corner on the main commercial street. Eleanor stood across from it for several minutes, studying the building and its surroundings, trying to reconstruct Caleb's account of events. The telegraph office he'd mentioned was indeed nearby, 2 buildings down, easily visible from the bank's entrance. If Caleb had been exiting the telegraph office when the robbery occurred, he would have had a clear view of men holding horses in the street. Eleanor entered the telegraph office, where a young clerk looked up from his work with professional courtesy. "Help you, ma'am?" "I hope so. I'm trying to verify whether a man sent a telegram from this office approximately 3 weeks ago. Dark-haired cowboy, late 20s, would have been sending money to Wyoming." The clerk's expression shifted from helpful to guarded. "That's confidential information, ma'am. We don't discuss customer transactions." Eleanor had anticipated this resistance. She placed several silver coins on the counter. "I'm not asking for details about the telegram contents, just confirmation that someone matching that description was here on the morning of November 6th. The clerk eyed the money, clearly tempted, but shook his head. "I'm sorry. Company policy is absolute. If you need information for legal purposes, you'll have to get a court order." Dead end. Eleanor thanked him and left, frustration building. The general store proved more fruitful. The owner, a talkative man in his 50s named Morrison, remembered the morning of the robbery vividly. "Hell of a day," he said, leaning against his counter. "We heard the shots, people running and screaming. I locked my doors immediately, didn't reopen until the sheriff gave the all clear." "Did you see anything before the shooting started? Anyone suspicious in the street?" Morrison scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Saw 3 fellows with horses near the bank, looking nervous. One of them kept checking his pocket watch like he was timing something. But there were plenty of other folks around too. Saturday mornings busy for commerce." "What about a dark-haired cowboy coming out of the telegraph office?" Eleanor described Caleb as precisely as she could. "Maybe. Hard to say. Lots of cowboys in and out of town." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "Why are you asking about this particular fellow?" Eleanor made a split-second decision to be partially honest. "He's been accused of involvement in the robbery. I'm trying to determine if he was actually elsewhere when it happened." "You law?" "Private citizen. He worked for me briefly, and I believe he's innocent." Morrison studied her for a long moment, then said carefully, "Ma'am, I appreciate you trying to help someone you think got wrongly accused, but if the marshals arrested him, they probably have good reason. Best to let justice take its course." "Justice requires all the facts, Mr. Morrison." "That's what I'm trying to gather." "Well, I can't help you much. I was too focused on the robbers themselves to notice everyone else on the street. You might try the witnesses who testified to the sheriff. They're listed in the official report." "Where would I find that report?" "Sheriff's office, 2 blocks south, but I doubt they'll share it with civilians." Eleanor thanked him and headed for the sheriff's office, her spirits sinking. Every avenue seemed blocked by official policies or faded memories. How was she supposed to build a defense when the basic investigative work proved impossible? The sheriff's office was manned by a grizzled deputy who listened to Eleanor's request with barely concealed impatience. "The investigation's ongoing, ma'am. We can't release reports to the public." "I'm not asking for the full investigation, just the names of witnesses who saw the robbery, so I can interview them myself." "Can't help you with that either. Witnesses have a right to privacy." Eleanor's patience, already stretched thin by days of travel and mounting anxiety, finally snapped. "A man's life is at stake. Doesn't that warrant some cooperation?" "Not from this office, it doesn't." The deputy's tone turned cold. "If you have information relevant to the case, provide it through official channels. Otherwise, stop interfering with law enforcement business." Eleanor left before she said something that would land her in a cell next to Caleb. Outside, she stood in the afternoon sun, fury and helplessness warring in her chest. She'd traveled 3 days, spent precious money, invested hope in finding evidence, and accomplished nothing. Every door had slammed shut. Every potential lead evaporated. A voice behind her said quietly, "You're asking about the bank robbery." Eleanor spun to find a woman in her 30s, plainly dressed, with intelligent eyes and a cautious demeanor. She'd been sweeping the steps of a nearby building, but now stood watching Eleanor with careful assessment. "I am," Eleanor said. "Do you know something?" "Possibly, but not here." The woman glanced at the sheriff's office. "There's a tea house on Adams Street, 2 blocks east. Meet me there in an hour. Come alone." Before Eleanor could respond, the woman returned to her sweeping, dismissing her as completely as if the conversation had never happened. Eleanor spent the intervening hour in a state of anxious anticipation, alternating between hope that this mysterious woman had useful information and fear that it was some kind of trap. But she'd come too far to ignore potential leads, no matter how strange the circumstances. The tea house was a small, genteel establishment catering to Prescott's growing population of middle-class women. Eleanor felt conspicuous in her travel-worn clothing among the well-dressed customers, but she found a corner table and ordered tea she didn't want. The woman arrived exactly on time, settling across from Eleanor with the quick efficiency of someone accustomed to managing limited time. "I'm Sarah Delacourt," she said quietly. "I work as a clerk at the bank." Eleanor's heart leaped. A bank employee, someone who'd been inside during the robbery. "Eleanor Whitaker, thank you for speaking with me." "I'm not sure I should be," Sarah admitted, "but I overheard your conversation with Morrison and the deputy. You're trying to help someone accused of being the fourth robber." "Yes, I believe he's innocent, that he witnessed the robbery but wasn't part of it." Sarah cupped her hands around her tea, clearly wrestling with some internal decision. The official story, the one the marshals are building, is that there were 4 men involved, 3 who entered the bank and 1 who held horses outside. But that's not what I saw. Eleanor leaned forward. "What did you see?" "Only 3 men total. 3 men on horses who rode up, tied their mounts in front and came inside. No 4th person holding horses. No lookout. Just 3 robbers who were either very confident or very stupid." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "I told this to the sheriff initially, but he seemed more interested in the 4th man theory. Said my memory must be confused because of trauma." "Why would they push a narrative that contradicts witness testimony?" "Because it's cleaner," Sarah said bitterly. 3 dead robbers plus 1 captured accomplice makes for a tidy case with someone to prosecute. 3 dead robbers and no other suspects means the case stays open, makes law enforcement look incompetent. Eleanor felt something click into place. The ugly political reality beneath the surface of frontier justice. "You're saying they need Caleb to be guilty." "I'm saying the truth is complicated and doesn't fit the story they want to tell." Sarah met Eleanor's eyes. "Your friend, what's his name?" "Caleb Rourke." "Mr. Rourke may be completely innocent, but innocent men get convicted when the machinery of justice decides guilt is more convenient than continued investigation." "Will you testify to what you saw? At his trial?" Fear flickered across Sarah's face. "I could lose my position. The bank's president has made clear he supports the marshal's investigation fully. If I contradict the official narrative, a man could die," Eleanor said urgently, "hanged for crimes he didn't commit. Doesn't that outweigh job security?" "Easy to say when it's not your livelihood at stake." Sarah's voice held no anger, just exhausted resignation. "I have a daughter, Mrs. Whitaker. Her father died in a mining accident 4 years ago. My bank salary barely covers our expenses. If I lose this position, we could end up destitute." Eleanor understood the calculation, the brutal arithmetic of survival that forced impossible choices. How could she ask this woman to sacrifice her child's security for a stranger's justice? "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I shouldn't have pressured you." "I didn't say I wouldn't do it." Sarah's jaw tightened with determination. "I said it would cost me. That's different from impossible. If your lawyer can guarantee my testimony is recorded officially, that I'm called as a sworn witness rather than making informal statements that can be dismissed, then I'll testify to what I actually saw." Hope surged fierce and bright in Eleanor's chest. "You mean it?" "I mean it. Because you're right. A man's life outweighs my comfort." Sarah stood, gathering her things. "Have your lawyer contact me through the bank. But Mrs. Whitaker, understand that this may not be enough. One witness contradicting the official narrative might not overcome all the other evidence they've assembled." "It's more than I had an hour ago. Thank you, Miss Delacourt. You have no idea what this means." "I think I do." Sarah smiled sadly. "We women understand what it's like to fight for justice in a system designed to ignore us. Good luck, Mrs. Whitaker. I hope your Mr. Rourke deserves the faith you're placing in him." After Sarah left, Eleanor sat alone in the tea house, her tea cold and untouched, her heart hammering with renewed hope. One witness. one crucial piece of testimony that could undermine the prosecution's entire theory. It wasn't enough to guarantee acquittal, but it was a foothold, a crack in the wall of circumstantial evidence threatening to crush Caleb. She had 3 days before meeting Nasha for the return journey. 3 days to find additional witnesses, gather more evidence, build the strongest possible case. Eleanor left the tea house and walked Prescott's streets with new determination, approaching anyone who might have seen something relevant, enduring rejection after rejection, slowly assembling fragments of information. A merchant who remembered Caleb buying supplies that morning couldn't swear to exact timing, but confirmed he'd been in town. A stable hand who'd noticed 3 nervous men with good horses, no fourth person with them. A child who'd seen the wounded robber fall from his horse 2 miles north, only 2 riders fleeing, not 3. Piece by piece, detail by detail, Eleanor constructed an alternative narrative. It was incomplete, riddled with gaps and uncertainties. But it existed. A version of events where Caleb Rourke was exactly what he claimed, a witness who'd made the mistake of pursuing justice and been caught in the machinery of expedient prosecution. On the 3rd day, exhausted but grimly satisfied with her work, Eleanor met Nasha for the return journey to Copper Ridge. The ride back felt different, still grueling, still tense with uncertainty, but powered by purpose rather than desperation. She carried pages of notes, names of potential witnesses, and one crucial ally willing to contradict the prosecution's theory. It might be enough. It had to be enough. Because the alternative, watching Caleb hang for crimes he didn't commit while she stood helpless, was unthinkable. The desert stretched endlessly under the vast sky, and Eleanor rode toward whatever future awaited with the fierce determination of a woman who'd stopped running from life and started fighting for it. Eleanor arrived back in Copper Ridge the evening before the preliminary hearing, her body aching from 6 days of hard travel, but her mind sharp with purpose. She went directly to Herbert Ashford's office, where lamplight still burned in the upstairs window despite the late hour. Ashford looked up from his paperwork as she entered, surprise and hope flickering across his tired features. "Mrs. Whitaker, I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow morning." "I have information." Eleanor set her saddlebag on his desk and pulled out the pages of notes she'd compiled in Prescott. Witness statements, timeline contradictions, and most importantly, a bank clerk willing to testify that she saw only 3 robbers, not 4. Ashford's eyes widened as he scanned the documents, his legal mind clearly racing through implications. "This is extraordinary work. Miss Delacourte's testimony alone could undermine the prosecution's entire theory of conspiracy. Can you get her here for the hearing tomorrow?" "Tomorrow? That's impossible. We'd need time to arrange travel, prepare her testimony, ensure she understands courtroom procedure." Ashford set down the papers, his expression shifting from excitement to cautious assessment. "The preliminary hearing is merely to determine if sufficient evidence exists to proceed to trial. The judge won't hear full witness testimony at this stage." Eleanor felt her hopes deflate slightly. "Then what's the point of everything I gathered? It's invaluable for trial preparation, assuming we get that far. Tomorrow's hearing will focus on the marshal's evidence and whether it establishes probable cause. Our goal is to create enough doubt that the judge dismisses charges or at least reduces them significantly." Ashford stood, pacing his small office. "What you've provided gives me ammunition to challenge their timeline, to question witness reliability, to suggest alternative explanations. It may not win tomorrow, but it positions us strongly for what comes after. And if the judge finds probable cause and orders a trial, then we have approximately 3 weeks to bring Miss Delacourte and your other witnesses to testify, to build a comprehensive defense, to create reasonable doubt in the minds of a jury." Ashford met her eyes. "Mrs. Whitaker, I won't mislead you. Even with this new information, the case remains difficult. But you've given Mr. Rourke something he didn't have before, a fighting chance." Eleanor nodded, exhaustion suddenly crashing over her like a physical weight. "I'd like to see him, tonight if possible. The jail doesn't typically allow evening visits. I've been gone for 6 days. He deserves to know I came back, that I found something useful." Eleanor's voice cracked slightly. "Please." Ashford studied her for a long moment, then reached for his coat. "Come on. I have some influence with the night deputy. No promises, but we'll try." The Copper Ridge jail was dark except for a single lamp in the front office. The night deputy, an older man named Garrison, whom Eleanor recognized from church gatherings years ago, looked up from his newspaper with weary suspicion. "Evening, counselor, Mrs. Whitaker." His tone suggested he knew exactly why they were here and wasn't inclined to cooperate. "Mr. Garrison," Ashford said smoothly, "we're requesting a brief visit with the prisoner Rourke. 5 minutes, fully supervised. Mrs. Whitaker has just returned from gathering evidence for his defense and needs to consult with him before tomorrow's hearing." Garrison scratched his gray beard, clearly weighing policy against personal judgment. "It's irregular." "So is a lot about this case," Eleanor said quietly. "Please, I'm asking as a neighbor, not a stranger." Something in her tone, or perhaps the visible exhaustion in her face, softened Garrison's resistance. 5 minutes, and I stay within earshot." He led them through the familiar corridor to Caleb's cell. The sound of their footsteps brought Caleb to the bars immediately, his face haggard but alert. When he saw Eleanor, relief and concern wore visibly in his expression. "You're back. Thank heaven you're safe." His hands reached through the bars, and Eleanor grasped them tightly, the physical connection grounding her after days of uncertainty. "I went to Prescott, found witnesses who support your story, including a bank clerk who saw only 3 robbers." The words tumbled out quickly, urgently. "It's not everything we need, but it's something real, something that contradicts their narrative." Caleb's eyes closed briefly, emotion tightening his features. "You shouldn't have risked that journey for me. We've had this argument. You lost." Eleanor managed a tired smile. "The hearing is tomorrow morning. Ashford says the new evidence won't be presented in full yet, but it helps our position." "Eleanor," Caleb's grip on her hands tightened. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I need you to understand something. If the judge orders me to trial, if this drags on for weeks or months, you can't keep sacrificing everything for my defense. Your ranch, your savings, your reputation are mine to spend however I choose," Eleanor interrupted firmly. "We're past the point of you trying to protect me from consequences I've already accepted." "Stubborn woman," Caleb said, but there was profound gratitude beneath the exasperation. "You knew that when you stayed." Eleanor glanced at Garrison, who was pointedly studying the opposite wall to give them a semblance of privacy. She lowered her voice. "Caleb, when this is over, when you're free, because you will be free, what happens then?" "What do you mean? Do you stay? Do we try to build something real, or was everything between us just circumstance and proximity?" Caleb's expression grew achingly tender. "Eleanor, the only thing keeping me sane in here is the thought of returning to your ranch, to working alongside you, to building the life we barely started before all this chaos. If you'll still have me after everything I've put you through, that's not even a question. Then yes, I stay. I fight for us as hard as I'm fighting for my freedom." He brought her hands to his lips, kissing her knuckles with desperate tenderness. "Because you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. A reason to believe in tomorrow." "Time," Garrison called, not unkindly. Eleanor pulled Caleb close through the bars, kissing him with all the fear and hope and determination churning in her chest. He responded with equal intensity, and for just a moment the cell disappeared, the hearing vanished, and there was only the two of them and the promise of what might still be possible. "I'll be there tomorrow," Eleanor whispered against his lips. "First row. You'll see me the whole time." "That's all I need," Caleb whispered back. Garrison cleared his throat more loudly, and Eleanor forced herself to step back. She memorized Caleb's face, the hope flickering in his eyes, the set of his jaw, the way he stood despite days of confinement, like a man who hadn't given up. "See you in the morning," she said. "See you in the morning," he echoed. Outside, the night air felt impossibly cold after the warmth of the jail. Ashford walked Eleanor to the boarding house where she'd secured a room, offering last-minute reassurances about the hearing's proceedings. "Try to rest," he advised at the door. "Tomorrow will be long and likely frustrating. Preliminary hearings are technical affairs, not dramatic courtroom battles." "I understand. Thank you, Mr. Ashford, for everything you're doing." "I'm doing my job, Mrs. Whitaker. You're the one going above and beyond." He tipped his hat and disappeared into the darkness. Eleanor climbed the stairs to her rented room, every muscle screaming protest. She'd been in the saddle for days, operating on anxiety and determination, barely eating or sleeping properly. But her mind refused to quiet even as she lay in the unfamiliar bed, replaying every conversation from Prescott, every piece of evidence gathered, every possible outcome of tomorrow's hearing. Sleep came eventually, fitful and dream-haunted. Visions of Caleb in shackles, of courtroom doors slamming shut, of riding back to an empty ranch alone. Morning broke gray and cold, unusual weather for the Arizona territory, but fitting for the day's grim business. Eleanor dressed carefully in her most respectable clothing, a dark dress she'd worn to Thomas's funeral and kept for solemn occasions, armor for a different kind of battle. The courthouse was a sturdy brick building that also served as town hall and community meeting space. By the time Eleanor arrived, a crowd had already gathered, curious townspeople, businessmen with time to spare, and notably several women who watched Eleanor enter with expressions ranging from sympathy to scandalized disapproval. Eleanor held her head high and took a seat in the front row directly behind where Caleb would sit. She would not be ashamed, would not apologize for fighting for someone she believed in. Herbert Ashford arrived moments later, looking crisp and professional despite the early hour. He nodded to Eleanor before taking his position at the defense table. Then the bailiff brought Caleb in. He was shackled at the wrists and ankles, the chains rattling with each step, a sound that made Eleanor's stomach clench with fury and helplessness. But Caleb walked steadily, shoulders straight, and when his eyes found hers in the crowd, his entire demeanor softened with relief and gratitude. Eleanor placed her hand flat against her chest, a silent gesture that said, "I'm here, I believe." "I'm not leaving." Caleb's answering nod was barely perceptible, but she saw it. The judge entered. Territorial Judge Marcus Brennan, a man in his 60s with a reputation for fairness tempered by strict adherence to legal procedure. Eleanor had seen him at community events over the years, but never in his official capacity. "All rise," the bailiff called, and the courtroom rustled to its feet. Judge Brennan settled behind his bench, surveying the room with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Be seated. We're here for a preliminary hearing in the matter of Territory versus Rourke. Counselors, state your appearances." "Herbert Ashford for the defense, Your Honor." "Samuel Pritchard for the Territory, Your Honor." The prosecutor was a heavy-set man in his 40s whom Eleanor didn't recognize, likely brought in from the Capitol specifically for this case. "Mr. Pritchard, you may present your evidence establishing probable cause." What followed was exactly as technical and dry as Ashford had warned. Prosecutor Pritchard methodically laid out the Territory's case. Witness statements placing Caleb near the bank at the time of the robbery, testimony from townspeople identifying him as an associate of the deceased robber James Cord, physical evidence that Caleb had fled north after the incident rather than reporting to authorities. Marshal Cooper testified about tracking Caleb across 2 weeks, about the gunfight that had left Caleb wounded, about his eventual arrest at Eleanor's ranch. His testimony was precise, professional, damning in its accumulation of circumstantial connections. Eleanor listened with growing dread as the case against Caleb solidified into an apparently coherent narrative. A fourth conspirator who'd held horses, who'd panicked when the robbery went wrong, who'd killed one of his co-conspirators to eliminate a witness, who'd run rather than face justice. It sounded convincing, terrifyingly convincing. When Pritchard rested his case, Judge Brennan turned to Ashford. "Does the defense wish to present any evidence at this stage?" "We do, Your Honor." Ashford stood, radiating quiet confidence. "The defense wishes to challenge the prosecution's timeline and theory of conspiracy through documentary evidence and logical analysis." What followed was a careful dismantling of the prosecution's assumptions. Ashford presented telegraph records proving Caleb had been at the telegraph office at the time witnesses claimed to have seen him holding horses. He introduced receipts from the general store showing purchases made after the robbery, suggesting Caleb had remained in town rather than immediately fleeing. He challenged the identification of Caleb as a close associate of James Cord, presenting employment records showing they'd worked together for only 3 weeks on a single cattle drive. The prosecution would have this court believe that a brief professional acquaintance constitutes criminal conspiracy, Ashford argued. By that logic, Every man who's ever worked a cattle drive alongside someone who later committed a crime should be considered an accomplice. It's absurd. Pritchard rose to object, but Judge Brennan waved him down. I'm capable of assessing logical fallacies myself, Counselor. Continue, Mr. Ashford. Furthermore, Your Honor, the prosecution's theory requires that Mr. Rourke simultaneously held horses outside the bank while also being inside the telegraph office 2 buildings away. Unless he possesses the gift of bilocation, this is physically impossible. A ripple of amusement ran through the courtroom. Eleanor felt the first flicker of hope. Ashford pressed his advantage. The prosecution has presented a theory built on assumptions and circumstantial connections. They failed to produce a single witness who can definitively place Mr. Rourke holding horses outside the bank. They failed to establish any financial benefit to him. No unusual wealth, no hidden money, no evidence of the stolen funds in his possession when arrested. They failed to explain why a guilty man would remain in the vicinity of the crime for hours after it occurred, conducting ordinary business rather than fleeing immediately. The defendant did eventually flee, Pritchard interjected. After being shot by unknown assailants, Ashford countered. Self-defense and flight from persecution are not evidence of guilt in the original crime. Judge Brennan leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, his expression unreadable. Mr. Ashford, you've raised valid questions about the prosecution's timeline and theory. However, the standard for a preliminary hearing is probable cause, not proof beyond reasonable doubt. The question before me is whether sufficient evidence exists to believe a crime occurred and the defendant may have been involved. Eleanor's heart sank. He was going to bind Caleb over for trial. I understand the standard, Your Honor, Ashford said, but probable cause must be based on credible evidence, not speculation. The prosecution has woven a narrative that requires ignoring physical impossibilities and manufacturing connections where only casual acquaintance exists. Pritchard stood. Your Honor, the territory acknowledges that some details require further investigation. That's precisely why this matter should proceed to trial, where a full evidentiary presentation— Actually, Judge Brennan interrupted, I'm inclined to agree with Mr. Ashford that the prosecution's timeline is problematic. The courtroom went completely silent. Your Honor, Pritchard sputtered, the evidence establishes that Mr. Rourke was in Prescott on the day of the robbery and had a passing acquaintance with one of the robbers. Everything else is inference and assumption. Judge Brennan's voice was measured but firm. You've presented no direct evidence of participation, no witnesses who saw him holding horses or fleeing with the robbers, no financial evidence connecting him to the stolen funds. Eleanor gripped the bench in front of her, hardly daring to breathe. However, the judge continued, and Eleanor's hope wavered. The circumstantial evidence is sufficiently troubling to warrant further investigation. Therefore, I'm ordering the defendant bound over for trial, but on reduced charges. Your Honor, both lawyers began simultaneously. Judge Brennan silenced them with a raised hand. The charge of accessory to murder is dismissed for lack of evidence. The charges of conspiracy to commit robbery and accessory after the fact remain. Bail is set at $500. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Eleanor's mind reeled. Bail. He'd set bail. That meant Caleb could potentially be released pending trial. $500. An impossible sum. Her entire savings plus the money already spent on Ashford's fees might total $300 at most. Caleb turned in his seat, finding Eleanor's eyes. The hope and disbelief in his expression mirrored her own tumultuous emotions. Judge Brennan banged his gavel. Trial is set for 4 weeks from today. Mr. Rourke will remain in custody unless bail is posted. Court is adjourned. As the judge exited, the courtroom dissolved into chaos. Spectators talking excitedly, Pritchard arguing with Marshal Cooper in harsh whispers, Ashford gathering his papers with barely suppressed satisfaction. Eleanor pushed through the crowd to reach the defense table where Caleb still sat, guards preparing to return him to his cell. $500, she said desperately to Ashford. Is there any way to negotiate it lower? That's actually quite reasonable for charges of this severity, Ashford said. Judge Brennan was being lenient. But Mrs. Whitaker, you don't have to— How do I post it? What's the procedure? You'd need to provide either cash or property deed as collateral. If Mr. Rourke fails to appear for trial, you forfeit the full amount. Eleanor's ranch was worth considerably more than $500, but using it as collateral meant risking everything if something went wrong. If Caleb ran, not that she believed he would, but the legal system wouldn't care about her faith in him. If he was convicted and sentenced before bail could be returned. If any of a dozen catastrophic scenarios played out. She looked at Caleb, saw the mixture of hope and fear in his eyes, saw him silently begging her not to take this risk. "I'll put up my ranch," Eleanor said. "Eleanor, no." Caleb's voice was sharp with alarm. "You can't risk your home, everything you've built." "I can and I will." Eleanor turned to Ashford, ignoring Caleb's protests. "What do I need to do?" "I'll draft the paperwork this afternoon. We can file it with the court clerk tomorrow morning. If everything's in order, Mr. Rourke could be released by tomorrow afternoon." The guards were pulling Caleb to his feet, preparing to escort him out. He fought against their grip, desperate to make Eleanor understand the magnitude of what she was offering. "Eleanor, please, think about this. If I'm convicted, if something happens, then we'll deal with it together." Eleanor's voice was steady, certain. "You told me you were done running. Prove it. Come back to the ranch, help me prepare for trial, show everyone that you're exactly who you say you are." Caleb's resistance crumbled, emotion overwhelming him. "I don't deserve you." "Probably not, but you're stuck with me anyway." She managed a shaky smile. "See you tomorrow, Caleb Rourke. Try not to get too comfortable in that cell." As the guards led him away, Eleanor sagged against the table, the full weight of what she'd committed to finally hitting her. She was risking everything, her home, her security, her future, on faith in a man she'd known for barely 2 weeks. It was reckless, potentially ruinous, possibly the worst decision of her life. And yet she didn't regret it for a moment. Ashford touched her shoulder gently. "Mrs. Whitaker, are you certain about this? I can explore other bail options, perhaps find someone willing to keep—" "I'm certain." Eleanor straightened, gathering the composure that had carried her through Thomas's death and 11 years of solitary survival. "Draw up the papers, Mr. Ashford. Let's bring him home." The word home resonated strangely. When had she started thinking of the ranch as belonging to both of them? When had Caleb's presence become so woven into her vision of the future that his absence felt like amputation? She couldn't pinpoint the exact moment. Maybe it had been that first night when he'd collapsed bleeding on her doorstep. Maybe the storm when they'd finally stopped fighting their connection. Maybe it was cumulative. Every shared conversation, every moment of partnership, every glimpse of the man beneath the wounded drifter. It didn't matter. What mattered was the choice she'd made and intended to honor. The next 24 hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Eleanor spent the morning at the land office verifying her property deed, ensuring all documentation was in order. She endured the clerk's thinly veiled disapproval and the whispered speculation of other customers with gritted teeth and raised chin. Let them talk. Their opinions changed nothing. By afternoon, she'd signed papers that made her stomach clench with anxiety. Legal documents pledging her ranch as collateral, acknowledging she understood the risks, accepting full responsibility for Caleb's appearance at trial. Ashford reviewed everything with meticulous care before filing with the court clerk. Then more waiting while judges and bureaucrats processed paperwork with no sense of urgency. Finally, as the sun dipped toward the western horizon, a clerk emerged from the courthouse and nodded to Ashford. "Bail has been approved. The prisoner can be released." Eleanor's heart hammered as they walked to the jail for the third time in as many days. This time, when the doors opened and Caleb emerged, no shackles, no guards, just a free man in rumpled clothes carrying the few possessions he'd arrived with, she felt tears spring to her eyes. He stopped on the jailhouse steps, breathing deeply as if tasting freedom for the first time. Then his eyes found Eleanor's, and he crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, pulling her into an embrace that lifted her off her feet. "You're insane," he whispered into her hair. "Completely, wonderfully insane." "So I've been told." Eleanor clung to him, feeling the solid reality of his body, the warmth of his breath, the thundering of his heart against hers. "Welcome back. I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving you didn't make a mistake trusting me." "You'd better." She pulled back just enough to see his face, cupping his jaw with one hand. Because I just bet my entire future on you, Caleb Rourke. Don't make me regret it. Never, he promised. I swear on everything I am, I will never make you regret choosing me. They stood like that for a long moment, oblivious to the stares of passers-by, wrapped in each other and the fragile hope of second chances. Take me home, Caleb said softly. I've been dreaming about that ranch for days, about working beside you again, about sleeping in a real bed, about us, Eleanor finished. About us, he agreed. They collected Eleanor's horse from the stable and began the long ride back to the ranch, Caleb riding double behind her, his arms wrapped around her waist. The miles passed in comfortable, near silence, both of them too emotionally exhausted for extensive conversation, but drawing comfort from simple proximity. Darkness had fallen completely by the time the ranch came into view, a cluster of dark buildings against darker desert, distinguished only by the faint glow of starlight on weathered wood. Home. Eleanor had left it alone for over a week, and guilt pricked at her for the neglect. Animals would need tending, fences checked, a dozen small disasters likely awaiting her attention. But as they dismounted and Caleb's hands found hers in the darkness, Eleanor realized something profound. The ranch had been her fortress for 11 years, protection against loss, shield against vulnerability, monument to a past she couldn't release. Now, walking toward the house with Caleb beside her, it transformed into something different. Not a fortress, not a monument, a foundation, a starting point, a place where broken people could rebuild themselves and each other into something stronger than solitude. Inside, Eleanor lit lamps while Caleb built up the fire, their movements synchronized by growing familiarity. The simple domesticity of it, sharing space, coordinating tasks, existing in comfortable partnership, felt both revolutionary and ancient, like discovering something humans had been doing forever but which felt miraculous when finally experienced personally. Hungry? Eleanor asked, though her own appetite had vanished beneath emotional exhaustion. Starving, but more tired than hungry. Caleb sank into a chair by the now blazing fire, his face haggard in the flickering light. Eleanor, we need to talk about the trial, about strategy and what comes next. Tomorrow, Eleanor said firmly. Tonight, we just exist. No planning, no anxiety, no thinking about worst-case scenarios, just this moment, this peace. Caleb studied her for a long beat, then nodded. Tomorrow, he agreed. Eleanor prepared a simple meal of bread, cheese, and preserved fruit. They ate in front of the fire, and afterward Caleb pulled her close, tucking her against his side with careful tenderness. I miss this, he murmured. More than freedom, more than anything. I missed you. I was only gone 6 days. Felt like years. His fingers traced patterns on her shoulder. In that cell, I had too much time to think. About everything I've lost, everyone who's abandoned me. I kept waiting for the other boot to drop, for you to realize I was too much trouble. And instead, I mortgaged my ranch to spring you from jail. Eleanor tilted her head to look up at him. If that doesn't prove I'm committed to this insanity, nothing will. Insanity? Caleb repeated thoughtfully. Maybe. Or maybe it's the first truly sane thing either of us has done in years, taking a chance on connection instead of hiding in safety. Eleanor considered this, thought about the 11 years she'd spent locked in grief and isolation, convinced that protecting her heart required closing it entirely. Thomas would have liked you, she said suddenly. Caleb went very still. Why do you say that? Because you're like him in the ways that matter, honest, hardworking, willing to fight for what you believe in. Different in temperament and history, but similar in character. Eleanor paused, working through feelings she'd never articulated before. I think he'd want me to be happy again, to build a new life instead of just maintaining the one we'd started. Do I make you happy? Caleb's voice was almost hesitant, vulnerable in a way that made Eleanor's chest ache. Terrified and happy in equal measure, she smiled against his shoulder, which seems about right for anything worth having. They sat like that for a long time, the fire crackling, the desert night pressing close around the house, two damaged people allowing themselves to hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd found in each other what solitude could never provide. Eventually exhaustion won, and they moved to Eleanor's bedroom, collapsing into bed fully clothed, too tired for anything except sleep and closeness. Caleb's arms wrapped around her from behind, his breath warm against her neck, his presence solid and real, and finally, blessedly free. "Thank you," he whispered into the darkness. "For everything. For believing. For fighting. For risking everything when you didn't have to." "You're welcome," Eleanor whispered back. "Now sleep. Tomorrow we start preparing for the fight of our lives." "Together," Caleb said, and it sounded like a vow. "Together," Eleanor agreed, and wrapped in each other against the vast Arizona night, they finally slept. Not the sleep of the defeated or the desperate, but the sleep of people who'd found something worth fighting for and refused to surrender it without a battle. The next 3 weeks became a blur of relentless preparation. Eleanor and Caleb rose before dawn each day, splitting their time between maintaining the ranch and building the defense that might save his life. Caleb worked with fierce determination, as if proving through sheer labor that he deserved the faith Eleanor had placed in him. He repaired every fence, reinforced the barn's damaged roof, organized supplies with meticulous care, transforming the property from a widow's survival operation into a thriving partnership. In the evenings, they sat with Herbert Ashford, reviewing witness statements, rehearsing testimony, anticipating every angle the prosecution might exploit. Sarah Delacourt had agreed to travel from Prescott for the trial, bringing with her a courage that humbled Eleanor. The bank clerk was risking everything, her position, her reputation, her daughter's security, to tell the truth about what she'd witnessed. "She's braver than I gave her credit for," Caleb said one night after Ashford had departed. They sat on the porch in the cooling darkness, shoulders touching, watching stars emerge across the vast desert sky. "She's doing what's right despite the cost," Eleanor replied. "Same as you when you tried to pursue those robbers instead of looking the other way. Same as me when I chose to fight for you instead of protecting myself." Caleb's hand found hers, fingers lacing together. "Do you ever regret it? This whole mess I've brought into your life?" Eleanor considered the question honestly. 3 weeks ago she'd been alone, safe, locked in a carefully controlled existence that demanded nothing and offered even less. Now she was risking everything on a trial that could destroy her financially, socially, emotionally. Her neighbors avoided her. Merchants in Copper Ridge treated her with cold courtesy. She'd become the subject of gossip and speculation, her relationship with Caleb dissected and judged by people who'd never lived her loneliness or faced her choices. "No," she said simply. "I don't regret a moment. Whatever happens at trial, you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. The feeling that life isn't just survival, that there's still joy and partnership and hope." Caleb turned to face her fully, his features barely visible in starlight, but his voice thick with emotion. "If we win this trial, if I'm acquitted and free to build a real future, will you marry me?" The question hung in the desert air, enormous and terrifying and perfect. Eleanor's breath caught. Marriage. She'd been married once, had loved Thomas with the fierce devotion of youth, had buried him and thought that chapter of her life sealed forever. The idea of opening herself to that vulnerability again, of legally binding her future to another person, of standing before the community that already judged her and declaring permanent commitment. "Yes," she heard herself say, "if you're acquitted, if we survive this, yes, I'll marry you." Caleb's smile was brilliant even in darkness. He kissed her with desperate tenderness, and Eleanor felt something unlock in her chest. The last barrier she'd maintained against complete vulnerability, finally crumbling. "Then I've got one more reason to win," Caleb whispered against her lips. "Because I want to spend the rest of my life proving I'm worthy of you." "You already are," Eleanor said. "Now you just need to prove it to 12 strangers." The trial began on a cold Monday morning in late November, the territorial courthouse packed with spectators who'd come from surrounding communities to witness the proceedings. Eleanor dressed carefully in her dark dress, armor for battle, and rode into Copper Ridge with Caleb beside her. They'd decided to arrive together, refusing to hide their relationship or pretend shame for choices they'd made. The stares and whispers followed them through town, but Eleanor kept her head high and her hand visibly on Caleb's arm. Let them look. Let them judge. Their opinions couldn't touch the truth of what she and Caleb had built together. Inside the courtroom, Herbert Ashford waited at the defense table, looking simultaneously confident and nervous, the demeanor of a lawyer who believed in his case but understood the capriciousness of frontier justice. "Mrs. Whitaker, Mr. Rourke," he nodded to them both. "Are you ready?" "As we'll ever be," Caleb said. Sarah Delacourt sat in the witness area, her face pale but determined. She'd arrived the previous evening, leaving her daughter with trusted friends in Prescott. Eleanor had met with her briefly, thanking her again for her courage, promising that regardless of outcome, she'd ensure Sarah didn't suffer financially for her testimony. The jury filed in, 12 men ranging from early 20s to late 60s, representing the territory's demographic mix of ranchers, merchants, laborers, and one schoolteacher. Eleanor studied their faces, trying to gauge sympathies, but found only the careful neutrality of people taking their civic duties seriously. Judge Brennan entered, and the bailiff called the court to order. Samuel Pritchard stood to deliver his opening statement, painting Caleb as a calculating criminal who'd partnered with known outlaws to rob the Prescott Bank and then murdered his co-conspirator to eliminate a witness. "The evidence will show," Pritchard intoned, "that the defendant had both opportunity and motive. He knew the victim, James Cord, from prior employment. He was present in Prescott on the day of the robbery. He fled the scene rather than assisting law enforcement, and when confronted, he killed Cord to prevent testimony that would implicate him in the crime." It sounded damning. Eleanor watched the jury's faces, saw doubt and suspicion settling like dust. Then Ashford rose for the defense. "Gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice calm and measured. "The prosecution would have you believe a simple story. Guilty man commits crime, guilty man runs, guilty man gets caught. But the truth is far more complex. Caleb Rourke is not a criminal. He's a victim of circumstance and convenient narrative. The evidence will show that he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, that he made the mistake of trying to help rather than looking away, and that he's been pursued ever since by men more interested in closing a case than finding the truth." The opening statement set the tone for 3 days of testimony that felt like siege warfare, the prosecution building their circumstantial case brick by methodical brick, the defense chipping away at foundations, exposing cracks, creating doubt. Marshal Cooper testified about tracking Caleb, about the evidence of flight and the gunfight that ended with Caleb wounded. Under Ashford's cross-examination, he admitted that Caleb had never fired first, that the men pursuing him had been bounty hunters rather than law enforcement, that Caleb's wounds were consistent with defensive action. "So you're saying my client defended himself against armed men trying to kill him?" Ashford pressed. "That appears to be the case," Cooper admitted reluctantly. "And you consider self-defense evidence of guilt in the original robbery?" "I consider flight from justice suspicious. But if he wasn't guilty of any crime, wouldn't he be fleeing persecution rather than justice?" Pritchard's objection was sustained, but the point had landed. Eleanor saw several jurors exchange glances, saw the first seeds of doubt taking root. Witnesses from Prescott testified to seeing Caleb near the bank, but under cross-examination their certainty wavered. One admitted he'd only seen a dark-haired man from a distance. Another acknowledged that his identification had come after hearing descriptions circulated by law enforcement. A third couldn't swear the man he'd seen was definitely the same person sitting at the defense table. "So your identification is based on general appearance rather than specific recognition?" Ashford asked. "I suppose so," the witness admitted. The prosecution's case was circumstantial, but accumulating. Eleanor felt anxiety twist tighter with each testimony, each piece of evidence that made Caleb's involvement seem plausible, if not proven. Then Sarah Delacourt took the stand. She wore a simple dress and carried herself with quiet dignity as she was sworn in. Pritchard questioned her first, establishing that she'd been working at the bank during the robbery, that she'd witnessed the 3 masked men enter and threaten customers. "And how many men did you see holding horses outside the bank?" Pritchard asked. "None," Sarah said clearly. "The 3 robbers arrived on horseback, tied their horses to the post outside, and entered together. No 4th person was waiting with the horses." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Pritchard's expression tightened. "Are you certain? Perhaps in the confusion?" "I'm absolutely certain. I was standing near the window when they arrived. I watched them dismount and tie their horses. 3 men, 3 horses, no accomplice waiting outside." But surely in your terror your memory might be— Objection, Ashford said. Counsel is badgering his own witness. Sustained, Mr. Pritchard. Move on. Pritchard tried to undermine Sarah's credibility, suggesting trauma had confused her memories, but she remained steady under questioning. When Ashford's turn came for cross-examination, he kept it brief. Miss Delacourt, have you been pressured to change your testimony? Yes. My supervisor at the bank suggested I might be mistaken about the number of men, that perhaps I should defer to other witnesses. But you're testifying to what you actually saw. I'm testifying to the truth. 3 men committed the robbery. No 4th person assisted them. Thank you, Miss Delacourt. No further questions. The impact was visible. Jurors who'd seemed convinced of Caleb's guilt now looked uncertain. The prosecution's entire theory rested on the existence of a 4th conspirator, and Sarah's testimony had undermined that foundation. But Pritchard wasn't finished. He called a surprise witness, a bounty hunter named Garrett, who claimed to have encountered Caleb 2 years earlier in New Mexico territory, running with a gang of cattle thieves. The defendant was part of a crew rustling cattle from ranches along the Rio Grande, Garrett testified. I recognized him immediately when the wanted posters went up for the Prescott robbery. Eleanor's heart plummeted. This was new evidence, devastating if believed. Ashford approached cross-examination with visible tension. Mr. Garrett, you claim you saw my client with cattle rustlers 2 years ago. That's right. And yet you never reported this to authorities at the time? Wasn't my concern. I only chase bounties when money's offered. How convenient that your memory suddenly improved when there was reward money for identifying bank robbers. Ashford's tone dripped skepticism. Tell me, Mr. Garrett, have you ever been convicted of perjury? Garrett's face reddened. That was dismissed. But you were charged with providing false testimony in a murder trial 3 years ago in Colorado, weren't you? Objection! Pritchard rose. Relevance? It speaks to the witness's credibility, Your Honor. I'll allow it. Answer the question, Mr. Garrett. I was charged, but it was dismissed, Garrett repeated sullenly. Because the prosecution realized you were lying to collect reward money, Ashford pressed. Objection. Speculation. Withdrawn. Ashford turned to the jury. Gentlemen, I leave it to you to determine whether a man previously accused of perjury in exchange for money might be motivated to lie again for the bounty on this case. The damage to Garrett's credibility was severe, but Eleanor knew the testimony would linger in jurors' minds. One doubtful witness against Caleb's character could override a dozen inconsistencies in the prosecution's case. Then came the moment Eleanor had been dreading, her own testimony. Ashford called her as a character witness, and she walked to the stand on trembling legs, acutely aware of every eye in the courtroom judging her, assessing her relationship with Caleb, questioning her motives. After being sworn in, she met Ashford's encouraging gaze and steadied herself. Mrs. Whitaker, how did you meet the defendant? He rode onto my property injured and bleeding, seeking shelter. I provided medical assistance and allowed him to stay while he recovered. What was your impression of Mr. Rourke during the time he spent at your ranch? Eleanor chose her words carefully. He was hard-working, honest, respectful. He insisted on earning his keep despite his injury. He showed no signs of wealth or hidden money. His behavior was that of a man grateful for help, not a criminal hiding from justice. Did he ever threaten you or make you feel unsafe? Never. In fact, he tried repeatedly to leave despite his condition, concerned about bringing trouble to my door. I had to convince him to stay until he was strong enough to travel. Ashford nodded, satisfied. Thank you, Mrs. Whitaker. Then Pritchard rose for cross-examination, and Eleanor braced herself. Mrs. Whitaker, isn't it true that you've developed a romantic relationship with the defendant? Heat flooded Eleanor's face, but she kept her voice steady. We've become close, yes. How close? Close enough that you mortgaged your ranch to post his bail? I believe in his innocence. I wanted to help. Or perhaps you've become emotionally involved to the point where your judgment is compromised. Pritchard's tone was almost gentle, pitying. A lonely widow, isolated for years, suddenly presented with a charming young man who needed rescue. Isn't it possible you've convinced yourself of his innocence because the alternative is too painful? Ashford objected, but Eleanor held up a hand. May I answer? Judge Brennan nodded. You may. Eleanor looked directly at the jury, speaking from her heart. I've been alone for 11 years. I've learned to survive, to make hard decisions, to protect myself. I'm not some naive girl blinded by romance. I'm a woman who's lived long enough to recognize character when I see it. Caleb Rourke is not a criminal. He's a good man who's been knocked down by circumstances and is fighting to stand back up. I'm helping him because it's the right thing to do, not because I'm foolish or desperate. The courtroom was silent. Even Pritchard seemed momentarily at a loss for response. No further questions, he finally said. Eleanor returned to her seat, Caleb's eyes following her with profound gratitude and something deeper. Love, she realized. Absolute, unconditional love. The final day of trial brought closing arguments. Pritchard made his case with prosecutorial certainty, insisting that the accumulation of circumstantial evidence pointed inevitably to guilt. Ashford countered with a passionate defense, attacking each weakness in the prosecution's theory, highlighting the absence of direct evidence, emphasizing Sarah Delacourte's eyewitness testimony contradicting the fourth conspirator theory. Gentlemen of the jury, Ashford concluded, the prosecution wants you to convict based on assumptions and convenience. They want you to believe that knowing a criminal makes you a criminal, that being present near a crime makes you guilty of that crime, that defending yourself when attacked proves original guilt. But that's not justice. That's expedience. Caleb Rourke deserves better. The truth deserves better. And you, as guardians of justice in this territory, deserve to render a verdict based on evidence rather than speculation. Judge Brennan instructed the jury on the law, emphasizing the requirement of proof beyond reasonable doubt, and sent them to deliberate. Then came the waiting. Eleanor and Caleb sat together in the courtroom hallway, hands clasped, not speaking because words felt inadequate. Sarah Delacourte joined them briefly, her face drawn with tension. Whatever happens, she said quietly, I'm glad I told the truth. My conscience is clear. You were remarkable up there, Eleanor said, brave beyond measure. So were you. Sarah managed a tired smile. Both of you. Fighting for each other the way you have, it gives me hope that decent people still exist in this territory. An hour passed, then 2. Eleanor's nerves stretched to breaking point with each minute, imagination conjuring a dozen catastrophic scenarios. Finally, after 3 excruciating hours, the bailiff emerged. Juries reached a verdict. The courtroom filled rapidly, spectators crowding in to witness the conclusion. Eleanor gripped Caleb's hand so tightly her knuckles went white, and he returned the pressure with equal desperation. The jury filed in, their faces carefully neutral. Eleanor tried to read their body language, searching for signs of sympathy or condemnation, but found nothing conclusive. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Brennan asked. The foreman, a weathered rancher named Patterson, stood. We have, Your Honor. What say you? Patterson cleared his throat, the single longest moment of Eleanor's life stretching between question and answer. On the charge of conspiracy to commit robbery, we find the defendant not guilty. Eleanor's vision blurred with tears. Not guilty. The words echoed like salvation. On the charge of accessory after the fact, we find the defendant not guilty. Caleb's hand convulsed in hers, his breathing ragged with relief. Around them, the courtroom erupted in murmurs, some disappointed, others approving, most simply surprised. Judge Brennan banged his gavel. Order! Mr. Rourke, you are hereby acquitted of all charges and free to go. Bail collateral will be returned to Mrs. Whitaker. This court is adjourned. For a moment, neither Eleanor nor Caleb could move. They sat frozen, the reality of freedom slowly penetrating the shock and fear they'd carried for weeks. Then Caleb turned to her, tears streaming down his face, and pulled her into an embrace that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. We did it, he whispered. We actually did it. You did it, Eleanor corrected. You stood firm. You fought. You proved them wrong. Around them, well-wishers approached, Sarah Delacourte crying with relief, Herbert Ashford permitting himself a satisfied smile, even a few townspeople who'd doubted Eleanor's judgment now offering grudging congratulations. Outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun painted the desert in shades of gold and amber. Eleanor and Caleb stood on the steps, breathing free air, feeling the weight of weeks of anxiety finally lifting. "So," Caleb said, a slow smile spreading across his face, "you said yes to marrying me if we won." "I did say that." "Does the offer still stand?" Eleanor pretended to consider, drawing out the moment. "I suppose it does, though I have conditions." "Name them." "You work the ranch as an equal partner, not a hired hand. You make decisions with me, not for me. And you never, ever bring home another bullet wound that requires me to play frontier surgeon." Caleb laughed, the sound joyous and free. "I can manage those terms. Do I get to add any conditions of my own?" "Such as?" "You stop trying to carry everything alone. You let me share the burdens as well as the joys. And you never doubt for a moment that you're the best thing that's ever happened to me." Eleanor's throat tightened with emotion. "I think we can both agree to those terms." "Then we have a deal, Mrs. Soon-to-be Rourke." They married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the ranch, with Herbert Ashford serving as witness and Sarah Delacourt traveling from Prescott to attend. Dutch Carmichael surprised Eleanor by appearing with a wedding gift, a breeding pair of cattle to help expand the ranch's herd, his way of acknowledging he'd been wrong to doubt her judgment. The ceremony was brief, the vows traditional, but when Eleanor spoke the words binding her life to Caleb's, she felt a profound rightness settle over her. This wasn't replacing what she'd had with Thomas. It was honoring it by choosing to live fully again, to embrace possibility rather than hiding in safety. That night, lying in their shared bed with her new husband's arms around her, Eleanor reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them here. From Caleb's desperate arrival bleeding on her doorstep to this moment of hard-won peace, they'd survived trials that would have broken weaker people. "What are you thinking?" Caleb murmured into the darkness. "That life is strange and unpredictable and sometimes impossibly generous," Eleanor said. "A month ago I was alone, convinced my future was just endless repetition of the past. Now I have you, a partnership, a reason to wake up excited about tomorrow." "The desert gave us to each other," Caleb said softly. "Harsh land, brutal conditions, but somehow it brought two broken people together and gave us a chance to heal." "Do you think we're healed?" "I think we're healing. Together." He tightened his embrace. "And I think that's all anyone can ask. Someone to share the journey, to help carry the weight, to remind you that you're not alone." Eleanor turned in his arms, finding his lips in the darkness, kissing him with all the gratitude and love and fierce determination that had carried them through their trials. Outside, the desert wind sang its ancient song across the mesas. The ranch, no longer a fortress of isolation, but a true home, settled into night around them. And two people who'd been knocked down by life but refused to stay down finally allowed themselves to believe in the future they were building together. The seasons turned as they always did in the Arizona territory. Winter brought cold nights and the hard work of maintaining livestock through sparse months. Spring exploded with unexpected rain and wildflowers, transforming the desert into a riot of color. Summer's brutal heat tested endurance but brought profitable cattle sales at market. Through it all, Eleanor and Caleb worked side by side, their partnership deepening with each shared challenge and small victory. Caleb proved to have a gift for horse training, and they gradually built a reputation for breeding quality stock. Eleanor's organizational skills, combined with Caleb's physical strength, created an operation more successful than either could have managed alone. The community's initial judgment gradually softened. People saw how hard Caleb worked, how devoted he was to Eleanor, how the ranch thrived under their joint management. Merchants who'd been cold became cordial. Neighbors who'd kept their distance began stopping by to trade goods and share news. Even those who'd been most scandalized by their relationship eventually accepted that sometimes unconventional partnerships produced the strongest results. Sarah Delacourt wrote regularly, reporting that she'd found new employment at a bank in Phoenix that valued her integrity more than her willingness to conform to convenient narratives. Her daughter was thriving, and Sarah credited her decision to testify truthfully, despite the professional cost, as the catalyst for positive changes in her life. "She's braver than she knows," Eleanor said, reading the latest letter aloud to Caleb over breakfast one morning, speaking truth to power when silence would have been easier. "Like someone else I know," Caleb said with a meaningful look. You taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to act despite fear because the alternative is living half a life. Eleanor reached across the table to clasp his hand. We taught each other. That's what partnership means. A year after Caleb's acquittal, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. At 58, she'd long since assumed motherhood was impossible, a door closed by age and circumstance. The news terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Are you sure? Caleb asked, his face cycling through shock, joy, and sudden anxiety. At your age, the risks are significant but manageable, Eleanor finished. I'm not naive about the dangers. But I want this, Caleb. A child born from our second chances, proof that life continues to surprise us. The pregnancy was difficult. Eleanor's body, though strong from years of ranch work, struggled with demands it hadn't faced in decades. She endured morning sickness, fatigue, the constant worry about complications. Caleb hovered protectively, insisting on taking over heavier work, treating her like precious glass. I'm pregnant, not dying, Eleanor protested when he refused to let her lift a feed bucket. You're carrying our future, Caleb countered. Forgive me for wanting to protect that. Their daughter arrived in early spring during a rare rainstorm, her first cries mingling with thunder rolling across the desert. The birth was long and exhausting, attended by a midwife from Copper Ridge who'd initially been reluctant to take the case but was won over by Caleb's desperate sincerity. When the midwife finally placed the squalling infant in Eleanor's arms, exhaustion evaporated beneath pure wonder. Tiny, perfect, impossibly alive. Their daughter represented everything they'd fought for. Second chances, hope, the audacity to believe in tomorrow. What should we name her? Caleb asked, his voice thick with emotion as he touched their daughter's impossibly small hand. Eleanor had been thinking about this for months, considering family names and meaningful choices. But looking at her daughter's face, only one name felt right. Hope, she said. We'll call her Hope. Caleb's eyes filled with tears. Hope Rourke, it's perfect. They raised Hope in the desert that had nearly destroyed them but ultimately brought them together. She grew strong and fearless, learning to ride before she could properly walk, helping with ranch chores as soon as she was able, absorbing her parents' hard-won wisdom about resilience and second chances. On Hope's 5th birthday, Eleanor stood on the porch watching her daughter chase chickens through the yard, while Caleb attempted to corral them back into their coop. The scene was chaotic, joyful, so completely different from the silent, controlled existence she'd maintained before Caleb's arrival that it felt like comparing winter to summer. Caleb caught her watching and abandoned chicken duty to climb the porch steps, pulling her close. Happy? He asked. Eleanor considered the question. Was she happy? Her life was harder in many ways than her years of solitary survival. A child brought constant demands, sleepless nights, new anxieties about safety and future. The ranch required endless work. Money was perpetually tight. Social acceptance remained conditional and fragile. But watching Hope laugh as she finally captured a stubborn hen, feeling Caleb's solid presence beside her, surveying land they'd transformed through partnership and effort. Yes, Eleanor said simply. I'm happy. Even though I complicated your peaceful existence, brought scandal and trial and all manner of chaos, especially because of that. Eleanor turned to face him fully. You gave me back my life, Caleb. Not the safe, controlled version I'd built after Thomas died, but something richer and messier and infinitely more worth living. Caleb kissed her, slow and tender, the kiss of people who'd fought for their happiness and refused to take it for granted. I love you, Eleanor Rourke, he said against her lips. I love you too, she whispered back. Even when you're covered in chicken feathers and our daughter has somehow gotten mud on the ceiling. They both turned to look at Hope, who had indeed managed to fling mud onto the porch ceiling through means neither parent could quite comprehend. How does she even... Caleb began. Don't ask. Just accept that our daughter is a force of nature. Like her mother. Eleanor laughed, the sound free and genuine, and pulled both her husband and daughter close. The desert stretched endlessly around their ranch, vast and unforgiving as always. But within their small corner of it, they'd built something the harsh land couldn't destroy. A family forged from second chances, a love born from desperate circumstances, a future that honored the past while embracing possibility. Years later, when Hope was grown and raising her own children on the ranch, she would ask her mother about the night Caleb first arrived. Eleanor would tell the story honestly, the blood, the fear, the impossible choice to trust a stranger that had changed everything. "Were you scared?" Hope would ask. "Terrified," Eleanor would admit, but more scared of dying alone, having never tried again, having never opened my heart to the possibility that life might still hold joy and partnership. "Do you regret anything?" Eleanor would look out across the land she and Caleb had built into something prosperous and enduring, at the grandchildren playing in the yard, at her husband still working beside her even in their advanced years, and she would smile. "Not for a single moment," she would say. "Your father taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to act despite fear because the alternative is living half a life. And I'm grateful every day that I chose to be brave." But that was years in the future. On this particular spring evening, with Hope finally corralled for bath time and Caleb stoking the fire against the cooling night, Eleanor stood at her kitchen window looking out at the ranch she'd once viewed as a prison and now recognized as a sanctuary. The desert had taken from her Thomas, years of isolation, the easy certainty of youth. But it had also given Caleb, Hope, a second chance at happiness she'd never expected to find. Life on the frontier didn't end with age, she'd learned. It rewarded those brave enough to begin again, to risk their hearts on uncertain futures, to choose connection over safety. Eleanor Whitaker Rourke had learned that lesson the hard way, and she'd never regretted a single moment of the difficult, beautiful, perfectly imperfect journey that had brought her here. Outside, the sun set over the mesas in brilliant oranges and purples, painting the sky with colors that seemed impossible but were utterly real. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as every day in the desert did. But Eleanor would face them with Caleb beside her, with Hope's laughter echoing through their home, with the certainty that she'd chosen right when she'd offered shelter to a bleeding stranger on a cold November night. The desert wind whispered across the land, carrying with it the promise of rain and renewal. And in a small ranch house nestled in an Arizona valley, a family built from second chances settled in for another evening, grateful for the life they'd fought so hard to claim. The end had become a beginning. And that, Eleanor thought as she joined her family by the fire, was the greatest gift the unforgiving desert had ever offered, the chance to start over, to build new dreams on the foundation of old sorrows, to discover that love and hope could flourish even in the harshest soil. She'd survived. They'd thrived. And under the vast western sky, that was victory enough for any life.